She stood at his door with frost in her hair and death in her eyes, holding a baby she was ready to surrender for a single piece of bread. The rancher, scarred, silent, broken by his own losses, should have turned her away like everyone else. But he didn't. He took them both. What happened next would shatter a violent man's grip, rebuild a mother's shattered soul, and prove that sometimes salvation comes not from those who speak the loudest, but from those who act when words fail. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The winter of 1871 came to the Colorado frontier like a punishment from God himself. It wasn't the kind of cold that nipped at your fingers or made you pull your coat tighter. No, this was the cold that carved itself into your bones, that turned breath into crystals before it left your lips, that made every step through the snow feel like wading through an ocean determined to pull you under. The sky hung low and gray, a suffocating blanket that hadn't broken in weeks, and the wind screamed across the plains with a voice that sounded almost human in its rage. Elena Ward no longer felt the cold. She'd stopped feeling it 3 days ago, somewhere between the trading post that had barred its doors against her and the homestead where a woman had set dogs on her. Now as she stumbled through snowdrifts that reached her thighs, her infant daughter clutched against her chest beneath her threadbare coat, she felt only a strange floating emptiness. Her feet moved because they had to. Her heart beat because it didn't yet know how to stop. The baby, Rose, she'd named her, though the name felt like a luxury now, like something from a life that belonged to a different woman, had stopped crying hours ago. That silence terrified Elena more than any scream could have. She pressed her cracked lips to the tiny forehead, feeling for warmth, for breath, for any sign that she hadn't already failed in the one task that mattered. "Please," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was talking to anymore. God had stopped listening somewhere back in Kansas. "Please, baby girl, just a little longer." The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional skeletal tree or snow-covered boulder. No smoke rising from chimneys. No lights in windows. Nothing but white and gray and the howling wind that seemed determined to erase every trace of human existence from this godforsaken stretch of earth. Elena's vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in like ink spreading through water. She'd eaten nothing but frozen berries and bark scrapings in 5 days. The last real meal, if you could call it that, had been nearly a week ago, when she'd traded her wedding ring for half a loaf of stale bread and a warning to never come back. Her legs buckled, and she crashed to her knees in the snow. For a long moment, she knelt there, swaying, the baby's weight the only thing keeping her upright. It would be so easy to just lie down, to let the cold finally finish what it had started. Rose would go quickly, they said. Children always did. It would be a mercy, almost. Better than watching her starve. Better than... No. The word came from somewhere deep, somewhere she thought had died with her first shred of hope. Elena forced her head up, forced her eyes to focus through the swirling snow. And there, perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, she saw it. A cabin. Not large, just a single-story structure with rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney, but solid. Real. And from that chimney rose a thin column of smoke, gray against the gray sky. The most beautiful thing Elena had seen in her entire life. She didn't remember standing, didn't remember starting to walk again, but suddenly she was moving, each step an act of pure will, her body operating on nothing but the animal instinct that had kept mothers moving since the dawn of time. The cabin grew larger, more defined. She could see a small barn behind it, a split-rail fence half buried in snow, a single window glowing with the faint amber light of a fire within. Someone was home. Elena's mind, dulled by hunger and cold, began to compose pleas. She would beg. She would grovel. She would offer anything, everything, for just enough food to keep Rose alive another day. Her pride, her dignity, her self-respect, none of it mattered anymore. Only the baby. Only getting the baby fed. She reached the porch just as her legs gave out completely. The impact of her knees hitting the wooden planks sent a jolt of pain through her body, sharp enough to cut through the numbness. The baby stirred against her chest, making a small, pitiful sound that was half whimper, half gasp. Elena clutched her tighter, then raised one trembling fist and hammered it against the door. "Please." Her voice came out as a croak, barely audible over the wind. Please, someone, anyone. She hit the door again, harder this time, leaving smears of blood from her split knuckles on the weathered wood. I need help. My baby, please, my baby needs. The door opened. Elena looked up through strands of ice-matted hair and saw him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe and hands that looked like they could break stone. His face was all hard angles and weathered skin, the kind of face that had seen too much sun and too much hardship, with a jaw dark with several days' worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Pale gray, the color of winter sky, and completely, utterly unreadable. He wore a simple wool shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the cold, and held a piece of wood in one hand, a carving knife in the other. He looked down at her without speaking, his expression neither welcoming nor hostile, just blank, as if he was looking at something he hadn't quite decided how to feel about yet. Please, Elena gasped, the word turning to fog in the freezing air. Please, sir, we need... She tried to stand, failed, slumped back against the doorframe. Just some bread, anything. I can work, I can clean, I can... He still said nothing. His eyes moved from her face to the bundle against her chest, where Rose's tiny hand had emerged from the blankets, blue-tinged fingers grasping at air. Elena's desperation crystallized into something sharp and terrible. She'd been turned away from 12 doors in the past 2 weeks. 12. She'd been called a whore, a beggar, a curse. She'd been told that her misfortune was God's judgment, that decent people didn't help women who'd obviously brought shame on themselves. She'd been spat on, threatened, driven away with guns and dogs and cold, hard silence. This would be the 13th door. And she knew with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose, that if he turned her away, this would be the last door she ever knocked on. There was nothing beyond this cabin but wilderness and death, so she did the unthinkable. Take her! The words came out before she could stop them, raw and broken and desperate. She fumbled with the blankets, trying to unwrap Rose with fingers that wouldn't cooperate. Please, God, please, take her. Keep her. I don't need anything for myself. Just give her food, give her warmth. Let her live, please. She's just a baby. She hasn't done anything wrong. Her voice cracked, shattered completely. Tears froze on her cheeks as she held Rose up, offering her child, her baby, her heart, her entire reason for breathing to this stranger. Take her instead, Elena sobbed. Just let my baby live. The man didn't move. He stood there, knife and wood still in his hands, his face carved from the same stone as the mountains that ringed the valley. The silence stretched so long that Elena thought he might not have heard her, or worse, that he had, and was deciding whether it was worth the trouble of even responding before shutting the door in her face. Then he moved. He set the wood and knife down on a small table just inside the door, his movements careful and deliberate. Then he stepped out onto the porch, and Elena saw that he wasn't wearing shoes, just thick wool socks that made no sound on the frozen planks. He knelt in front of her, close enough that she could see the small white scars that traced lines across his knuckles, the deeper scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his breath steamed in the frigid air. Up close, he looked older than she'd first thought, maybe 40, maybe more. There was gray threading through his dark hair, deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth, but it was a hard-earned age, not the soft decay of comfortable years. This was a man who'd survived things, who'd endured. He reached out, and Elena flinched instinctively. But he wasn't reaching for Rose. Instead, he began unwrapping the heavy canvas coat he wore over his shirt. A massive thing, fur-lined and patched in a dozen places, clearly made for work in brutal conditions. What are you... Elena started, but her voice failed as he draped the coat around both of them, wrapping it carefully to cover Rose completely, to shield Elena's exposed shoulders and arms. The weight of it was incredible, but it was the warmth. Oh God, the warmth trapped inside from his body heat that made Elena gasp aloud. The man stood, and before Elena could process what was happening, he bent and scooped both of them up as if they weighed nothing at all. One arm under her knees, the other supporting her back, cradling them both against his chest with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so large. He carried them inside. The cabin's interior hit Elena like a physical force. Heat, blessed, incredible heat, rolled over them from a stone fireplace where logs crackled and popped, throwing orange light across simple but solid furniture. A table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, shelves lined with tin plates and cups. Everything clean, everything in its place, everything speaking of a solitary life maintained with meticulous care. The man carried them to a chair near the fire and lowered them into it as carefully as if they were made of glass. Then he straightened, looked at them both for a long moment with those unreadable gray eyes, and turned away without a word. Elena sat frozen, not from cold anymore, but from sheer incomprehension. She'd offered to give him her child. She'd been prepared for him to take Rose and shut the door on her, or to refuse and send them both away to die. Those were the only 2 outcomes she'd imagined. But this? Warmth? Shelter? Silence that felt like acceptance? She watched as he moved through the cabin with the efficiency of someone who'd lived alone for a long time. He pulled a heavy blanket from the bed and brought it over, draping it over them both. Then he went to the shelves, taking down a tin cup and a small pot. He ladled something from a larger pot hanging near the fire. Soup, she realized, from the smell, and brought it to her. "I don't have any money," Elena whispered, finding her voice. "I can't pay you. I don't have anything to—" He shook his head once, sharply, and pressed the cup into her hands. The message was clear: drink. The soup was thin but hot, made with some kind of dried meat and root vegetables. Elena took one sip and nearly wept at the taste. Not because it was particularly good, but because it was food, real food, warm and solid and life-giving. She drank slowly, forcing herself not to gulp it down, knowing her shrunken stomach wouldn't tolerate too much at once. The man watched her drink, then moved back to the shelves. He returned with a small ceramic bowl and what looked like a clean piece of cloth. He gestured to Rose, who was starting to stir and whimper, then mimed eating. "You want to feed her?" Elena asked. "But I don't have anything to—" He disappeared into a back room. She hadn't even noticed there was a back room, and returned a moment later with a small bottle and a tin of what she realized was condensed milk. Her mind reeled. Who kept condensed milk in a bachelor's cabin? Who kept baby bottles? But she didn't ask, didn't dare question this strange mercy. She just watched as he prepared a thin mixture of milk and warm water, testing the temperature on his wrist with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. He handed her the bottle, and Elena held it to Rose's lips with shaking hands. The baby latched on immediately, sucking with desperate hunger, her tiny hands clutching at the bottle. Elena watched her daughter drink, watched color slowly return to those pale little cheeks, and felt something break loose in her chest, some last defense she'd been holding against the weight of the past months, the past years, the past lifetime of pain. She wept. Not quiet tears, but great shuddering sobs that racked her entire body. She cried for every door that had slammed in her face, for every night she'd spent in barns and ditches, for the husband who'd turned from gentle to monstrous, for the home she'd fled, for the life she'd thought she'd have, for the daughter who'd nearly died because her mother couldn't protect her. Through it all, the man said nothing. He moved to the fireplace, added another log, adjusted something in the flames. Then he settled into the other chair, the only other chair, and picked up his piece of wood and his knife, resuming whatever carving he'd been working on when she'd knocked. As if having a strange woman and baby break down in his home was the most normal thing in the world. Elena fed Rose until the bottle was empty, then tucked the baby against her shoulder and patted her back until a small burp emerged. Rose's eyes drifted closed almost immediately. Her tiny body finally relaxed, finally safe. Elena held her close, wrapped in the man's coat and the blanket, feeling warmth seep back into her bones, inch by inch. She watched her silent host carve. His hands moved with surprising delicacy, the knife taking away tiny curls of wood with each precise stroke. She couldn't see what he was making, something small, something detailed, but there was something almost meditative about the way he worked, his focus complete, his breathing steady and even. Outside, the wind still howled. Snow still fell. The world beyond these 4 walls remained a frozen hell. But inside, there was fire. There was warmth. There was silence, yes, but not the hostile silence of rejection. This was different. This was the silence of someone who'd said everything that needed saying with actions instead of words. "What's your name?" Elena finally asked, her voice hoarse. He didn't look up from his carving. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice rough from disuse, deep as winter thunder, "Jonas." Just that, nothing more. No last name, no elaboration, just Jonas. "I'm Elena," she offered. "Elena Ward. And this is Rose." A slight nod, acknowledging, but he still didn't look at her, just kept carving. Elena's eyes grew heavy. The warmth, the food, the bone-deep relief of finally being safe, it all crashed over her at once. She tried to fight it, tried to stay awake, afraid that if she slept she'd wake to find this had been a dream, that she was still outside freezing to death while her mind conjured visions of rescue. But her body had other plans. Her eyes closed once, twice, 3 times. The last thing she saw before sleep finally claimed her was Jonas rising from his chair, setting aside his carving, and moving toward her with another blanket in his hands. The last thing she felt was the gentle weight of that blanket settling over her and Rose, tucked in with careful precision. The last thing she heard was the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind against the windows. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Ward slept without fear. When Elena opened her eyes, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was wooden, heavy beams running across it. Light filtered through a window, real glass, she noted with surprise, and fell in pale squares across rough floorboards. The air smelled of wood smoke and something cooking, something that made her empty stomach clench with sudden, ravenous hunger. She sat up with a gasp, panic flooding through her. Where was Rose? Where was... Easy. The voice came from across the room. Jonas stood by the stove. There was a stove, an actual cast-iron stove, stirring something in a pot. He gestured to the bed beside her. Elena looked down and nearly sobbed with relief. Rose lay on the bed next to where Elena had been sleeping, bundled in clean blankets, her little face pink and peaceful. She was breathing normally, no longer that shallow, desperate panting that had terrified Elena for days. "How long—" Elena's voice cracked. She swallowed, tried again. "How long was I asleep?" Jonas held up fingers. 1, 4, 14 hours. She'd slept for 14 hours. Elena looked down at herself and realized with a start that someone had removed her wet, frozen outer clothes. She still wore her thin dress and undergarments, but her coat, shawl, and ruined shoes were gone. In their place, she found herself covered in warm blankets, and she lifted the covers, wearing a pair of thick wool socks that were far too large for her feet. Her face flushed hot. "Did you—" Jonas shook his head firmly, pointed to himself, then made a gesture of turning away and covering his eyes. Then he pointed to her wet clothes, now hanging by the fire to dry, and mimed carefully removing only the outer layers. The message was clear. He'd taken off only what was necessary to keep her from getting sick, and he'd been respectful about it. "Thank you," Elena whispered. The words felt inadequate, impossibly small for what he'd done, but they were all she had. Jonas nodded once and turned back to his cooking. Elena watched him work, noting details she'd missed the night before. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, but every inch was used efficiently. Shelves lined one wall, filled with preserves, dried meat, bags of flour, and cornmeal. Hooks on the walls held tools, coats, and what looked like a rifle. The furniture was simple but well made. A sturdy table, 2 chairs, the narrow bed she was sitting on, and a smaller cot tucked in the corner. And everywhere, there were small signs of another life. A second pair of boots by the door, tiny, child-sized. A wooden horse on one shelf, worn smooth by small hands. A woman's shawl hanging on a peg, faded and dusty. A wedding photograph in a simple frame showing a younger Jonas with a pretty woman and a small boy, all 3 of them smiling. A family. He'd had a family. Elena's heart clenched. What had happened to them? But she didn't ask. Couldn't ask. Not when this man had saved her life without asking anything about her own losses, her own pain. Jonas finished whatever he was preparing and brought it to her. A bowl of porridge, thick and steaming, with a spoon and a cup of water. He set them on the small table beside the bed, then stepped back, giving her space. Elena ate slowly, savoring every bite. The porridge was plain, just oats and water and a little salt, but it was hot and filling and it stayed down, which was more than she could have asked for. Between bites, she checked on Rose, touching her forehead, counting her breaths, assuring herself over and over that her daughter was truly alive, truly safe. When she'd finished eating, Jonas took the bowl and brought it back to the basin. Then he turned to her and made a series of gestures, pointing to her, to the door, then making a walking motion with his fingers and shaking his head firmly. "You're not going anywhere." "I don't want to impose," Elena said quickly. "You've already done so much. If I could just stay until the storm breaks, maybe borrow some food for the road." Jonas crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, in daylight, she could see the color of his eyes more clearly. Not just gray, but gray with flecks of blue, like clouds over water. And in those eyes, for just a moment, she saw something break through the careful blankness, a fierce protectiveness, an adamant refusal that needed no words. He pointed to her, to Rose, to the bed, to the cabin. Then he pressed his palm flat over his heart and shook his head once, firmly. The message couldn't have been clearer. "You stay. I won't let you leave like this." Elena's throat closed up. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help us? You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've done, where I've come from." Jonas stood and crossed to the mantel above the fireplace. He picked up the photograph she'd noticed earlier and brought it back, holding it so she could see it clearly. The woman, the boy, the younger version of himself. Then he tapped the image and looked at her with such naked grief that Elena had to look away. He understood. He understood what it meant to lose everything. He understood desperation, survival, the kind of pain that carved holes in your soul. He didn't need her story because he had his own, and that was enough. Jonas set the photograph back on the mantel and returned to his chair by the stove, picking up his carving once more. Elena watched him for a long moment, this strange, silent man who'd answered her most desperate plea, not with judgment or demands, but with shelter and safety, and the kind of mercy that asked nothing in return. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside this small cabin, in the warmth and the quiet, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called. Hope. She settled back against the pillows, pulling Rose closer, and watched the firelight dance across the walls. Tomorrow she would think about what came next. Tomorrow she would figure out how to repay this kindness, how to move forward, how to build something from the wreckage of her life. But today, just for today, she would let herself rest. She would let herself and her daughter be warm and fed and safe. And she would trust in the silence of a man who knew that sometimes the most powerful answers came not from words, but from simply opening the door when someone knocked. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet that felt almost like peace. Elena moved through those first 72 hours in Jonas's cabin with the careful uncertainty of someone who kept expecting the dream to shatter. Each morning she woke convinced she'd find herself back in the snow, rose cold against her chest. The warmth and safety nothing but a cruel hallucination conjured by a dying mind. But each morning, the fire still crackled in the hearth. Jonas still moved quietly through the cabin, tending to tasks with methodical precision. And Rose still slept soundly, her breathing deep and even, color fully restored to her cheeks. On that third morning, Elena woke before dawn to find Jonas already dressed, pulling on his heavy coat by the door. She sat up quickly, alarmed, and he turned at the sound. "Where are you going?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with panic she couldn't quite hide. Jonas crossed to the table and picked up a small slate, the kind school children used, that she hadn't noticed before. He wrote in careful, deliberate letters, "Barn, stock, back soon." Of course, animals. In her fog of exhaustion and relief, Elena had completely forgotten that a rancher would have livestock to tend, even in a blizzard. She felt her face flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" She stopped, swallowed. "I'll have breakfast ready when you return." Jonas studied her for a moment, then shook his head and pointed firmly at the bed, making a sleeping gesture. "I can't just lie here while you work," Elena protested. "You've already done so much. Let me help, please." Something flickered across Jonas's face. Surprise, maybe, or something else she couldn't name. He hesitated, clearly weighing something internal, then nodded once and pointed to the stove, the coffee pot, the shelf where he kept the tin of grounds. Coffee. She could make coffee. It was such a small thing, such a simple domestic task. But as Jonas disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness and Elena carefully measured grounds into the pot, she felt something shift in her chest. For months, maybe years, she'd been nothing but a burden, a problem, something to be dealt with or discarded. Roy had made sure she knew it, hurling the words at her with increasing venom as his drinking got worse. Useless, worthless, more trouble than you're worth. But Jonas was letting her help, letting her contribute, even in this tiny way, trusting her in his space. Elena filled the pot with water from the pump. There was a pump right inside the cabin, which seemed like impossible luxury, and set it on the stove. While it heated, she checked on Rose, changed her diaper with one of the clean cloths Jonas had left in a neat stack, then carefully picked up around the cabin, putting away the dishes from the night before, straightening the blankets, sweeping dust from the floor with a worn broom she found in the corner. The cabin revealed itself more fully in the growing light. It was spare, almost austere, but everything in it was quality, built to last, built with care. The table had been sanded smooth as silk, the chairs fitted together with perfect joints. Even the shelves showed signs of skilled craftsmanship, each board precisely measured and placed. This wasn't the rough bachelor quarters she'd expected. This was a home someone had built with love and intention. Her eyes kept returning to that photograph on the mantel. The woman, Jonas's wife, obviously, had been beautiful in a quiet way, with dark hair pulled back from a gentle face and eyes that smiled even in the formal stillness of the portrait. The boy couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, gap-toothed and grinning, pressed against his father's side with obvious adoration. And Jonas himself looked so different, younger, yes, but more than that, open. His face held none of the careful blankness she'd come to recognize, none of the walls. He looked like a man who laughed easily, who'd never known the kind of silence that came from having nothing left to say. What had happened to them? Elena was still staring at the photograph when the door opened and Jonas came back in, bringing a gust of frigid air and a dusting of snow on his shoulders. He stamped his feet, hung his coat, then paused, noticing the swept floor, the tidy shelves, the coffee waiting. He looked at her, and for just a moment, something like gratitude crossed his face before the mask settled back into place. He poured himself a cup of coffee, took a sip, then gave her a small nod of approval before settling into his chair by the fire. They sat in companionable silence while the world outside slowly lightened from black to gray. Rose woke and fussed, and Jonas immediately stood and prepared her bottle without being asked, the movements automatic, practiced. Elena watched him test the temperature on his wrist, adjust the mixture, hand her the bottle with the same careful gentleness he showed in everything he did. "You've done this before," Elena said quietly. "Fed a baby. You knew exactly what to do that first night." Jonas's hands stilled for just a moment. Then he returned to his chair and picked up his slate. He wrote, "Had a son." Then, after a pause, he added, "Fever. 3 years ago." Elena's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry. And your wife?" Same time. 2 words that held an entire world of grief. Elena understood then why he kept the house so carefully, why the small boots still sat by the door, why he knew how to care for a child despite living alone. This cabin wasn't just a home. It was a memorial, every object in it a ghost of the life he'd lost. "Their names?" she asked gently. Jonas's hand shook slightly as he wrote, "Sarah, Finn." "Those are beautiful names," Elena said, and meant it. She fed Rose in silence for a moment, then added, "Finn would be about 8 now, wouldn't he, if he'd lived?" Jonas nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire, seeing something, someone Elena couldn't see. "Rose is 6 months old," Elena offered, "born in May, the last good month I had before." She trailed off, not sure how much to share, how much this silent man wanted to know about the mess of her life. But Jonas turned to look at her, his gray eyes patient, waiting, not demanding her story, but not refusing it either. Just present. willing to listen if she needed to speak. And God help her, she needed to speak. The words had been building inside her for so long, locked behind her teeth, fermenting in her chest until they felt like poison. Maybe it was easier to tell a stranger. Maybe it was easier to tell someone who wouldn't interrupt, wouldn't judge out loud, wouldn't tell her all the things she'd done wrong. His name was Roy, Elena began, her voice barely above a whisper. Roy Lark. We married 5 years ago, back in Illinois. He was good then, kind. He worked at his father's mill, saved money, built us a little house. He wanted children, a family. He said he wanted to build something that would last. Rose finished her bottle and Elena lifted her to her shoulder, patting gently, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows. Then the war came, Elena continued. Not the big war. That ended when I was still a girl. But there was fighting out west, conflicts with the tribes, and the government needed men. Roy enlisted, said it was his duty, said he'd be back in 6 months with enough pay to expand the mill. She paused, remembering the day he'd left, how handsome he'd looked in his uniform, how certain she'd been that everything would be fine. He came back 2 years later, Elena said, her voice hardening. But he wasn't the same man. Something in him had broken. He drank. Not just a glass of whiskey after work, but all day, all night. He'd wake up shaking, screaming about things he'd seen, and when he wasn't scared, he was angry. Jonas's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Just listened with that complete, focused attention that made Elena feel truly heard for the first time in years. It got worse after Rose was born, Elena said, the words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. He said the crying reminded him of sounds from the war. He'd rage at me for not keeping her quiet. He started hitting, just me at first, never Rose. I told myself it would get better, that he was sick, that he needed time, his family had money, and I thought maybe they could help us, get him to a doctor. She laughed, a bitter sound. But his family blamed me, said I wasn't a good enough wife, wasn't supportive enough. His mother told me I should be grateful Roy came back at all, when so many didn't, that it was my job to help him heal, no matter what it took. Elena's hands shook as she adjusted Rose in her arms. Last month, in early December, I found him standing over Rose's cradle in the middle of the night. He was drunk, and he was just staring at her. And he said, if I leave her outside, she'll learn to be quiet. They all learn eventually. Jonas went very still. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. I grabbed Rose and ran, Elena said. Just ran. I didn't pack anything, didn't plan anything. I just knew I had to get her away from him. His father had given him money for Christmas, for family expenses. And I took it, all of it. I knew it made me a thief, but I didn't care. I used it to get us on a train heading west, as far from Illinois as I could get. She looked down at Rose, who had fallen back asleep, innocent and trusting. The money ran out 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to find work ever since, but no one wants a woman with a baby and no husband. The few jobs I could get, washing, mending, they didn't pay enough for food and lodging both. So I'd work, buy food, and sleep wherever I could find shelter. Barns, mostly. Empty buildings, under bridges. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I've knocked on 47 doors in the past month. 47. Asked for help, for work, for anything. Some people just said no. Some called me names. One man offered to help if I left Rose outside and came in alone. I ran from that house so fast I lost one of my shoes in the snow. Elena finally looked up at Jonas, meeting his eyes directly. You're the first person who didn't turn me away. The first person who looked at me and my baby and decided we were worth saving. And I don't know why you did it, but I'll be grateful for it until the day I die. Jonas held her gaze for a long moment, then reached for his slate. He wrote slowly, carefully. You were desperate, not evil. Difference. Then, below that, anyone who turns away mother and baby, they are the evil ones. Elena felt tears burn her eyes. But I tried to give her to you. I was going to abandon my own child to save her life. What kind of mother does that make me? Jonas shook his head firmly and wrote, the kind who loves her child more than herself, the best kind. Something broke open in Elena's chest, some hard, locked place that had been holding her together through sheer will. She pressed her free hand over her mouth, trying to hold back the sob, but it came anyway, wrenching and painful. Jonas stood, crossed to her, and gently took Rose from her arms. He settled the baby in the small cradle by the fire. When had he moved that there? Then returned and, with the awkward care of someone unused to offering comfort, placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. Just that. No words, no platitudes, just the steady weight of his palm, warm and solid, telling her without speaking that she wasn't alone. Elena wept. She wept for the husband she'd lost before he ever died, for the home she'd fled, for every door that had slammed in her face, for every night she'd gone to bed hungry so Rose could eat, for every moment of terror and desperation and bone-deep exhaustion. She wept until her ribs ached and her throat burned and she had nothing left inside her but a hollow, trembling emptiness. And through it all, Jonas stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her grief. When Elena finally quieted, gasping and hiccuping and thoroughly spent, Jonas handed her a handkerchief, clean, pressed, smelling faintly of soap. She took it gratefully and wiped her face, feeling raw and exposed, but also somehow lighter, as if crying had released some of the poison she'd been carrying. "I'm sorry," she said hoarsely. "You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't ask for some broken woman and her baby to collapse on your doorstep and fall apart in your house." Jonas picked up his slate and wrote. House was too quiet anyway. Despite everything, Elena felt a small, watery laugh escape. That's one way to put it. Jonas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something approaching it. He moved to the stove and ladled out 2 bowls of stew from a pot she hadn't noticed him prepare. He set one in front of her, then settled into his chair with the other, eating with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Companionable, almost comfortable, the weight of shared stories, of acknowledged pain, the quiet of 2 broken people who'd found themselves unexpectedly in the same lifeboat, neither quite sure what came next, but willing to keep bailing water together until they figured it out. After breakfast, Jonas cleaned the bowls and then disappeared into the back room. He emerged a moment later carrying an armful of clothes, a wool dress, a shawl, thick stockings, undergarments. All women's clothes, all carefully preserved. He set them on the table and stepped back, his meaning clear. These were for her, if she wanted them. Elena ran her fingers over the dress. Good quality, practical, warm. Sarah's clothes. She looked up at Jonas, searching his face. "Are you sure? I don't want to—" Jonas nodded firmly, cutting off her protest. He pointed at her thin, worn dress hanging by the fire, then made a gesture of throwing something away. Her dress was ruined, unsalvageable. She needed something to wear, and these clothes weren't serving anyone hanging in a closet. "Thank you," Elena said softly. "I'll take good care of them." Jonas nodded, then pulled on his coat again and headed for the door. Before leaving, he wrote on his slate, "Rest, we'll be back by dark." Then he was gone, leaving Elena alone with Rose and the gentle crackling of the fire. Elena spent the day settling into the rhythm of the cabin. She washed herself carefully with warm water from the stove, relishing the feeling of being clean for the first time in weeks. She changed into Sarah's dress, which fit reasonably well. Sarah had been slightly taller, but similar in build. The fabric was soft against her skin, warm and well-made, and wearing it made Elena feel almost human again. She tended to Rose, fed her, sang to her softly, let her have some time on a blanket by the fire, kicking her little legs and waving her arms. The baby seemed transformed from the half-frozen creature they'd been just days ago, alert, responsive, even offering small gummy smiles that made Elena's heart feel too large for her chest. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Elena found herself exploring the cabin more thoroughly. Not snooping, she was careful to respect Jonas's privacy, but simply noticing. The carved wooden animals on the shelf were exquisite, each one unique: a bear, a rabbit, a horse, an eagle. The work of someone with both skill and patience. Several more pieces sat unfinished on a small workbench in the corner, including what looked like a rocking horse. The books on the shelf surprised her. Not many, maybe a dozen, but quality volumes. Shakespeare, Whitman, a worn Bible, a collection of Greek myths, a farmer's almanac, several books on animal husbandry and crop rotation. Someone in this house had been educated, or at least well-read. On the mantel, beside the family photograph, she noticed something else, a small wooden plaque carved with careful letters. She picked it up and read, "Home is where you choose to stay." Elena held the plaque for a long moment, running her thumb over the carved words. Had Jonas made this? Or Sarah? And when? Before the fever or after? She was still holding it when the door opened and Jonas returned, bringing the smell of cold air and livestock. He stopped when he saw her with the plaque, and something complicated crossed his face. "I'm sorry," Elena said quickly, setting it back. "I wasn't trying to pry." Jonas shook his head and approached the mantel. He picked up the plaque and held it, his expression distant. Then he wrote on his slate, "Sarah made it, our first year here." He paused, then added, "She was right." "It's beautiful," Elena said. "The sentiment, I mean." Jonas set the plaque back carefully, positioning it just so. Then he moved to the stove and began preparing dinner. Salt pork, beans, cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet. Elena tried to help, but he waved her away, clearly more comfortable working alone. So she sat with Rose and watched him move through the familiar motions, struck by how much care he took with even simple tasks. They ate together as the last light faded from the windows. Rose fussed a bit, and Jonas prepared her bottle without being asked, his movements now completely natural. After dinner, Elena washed the dishes while Jonas carved by the fire, and the domesticity of it all felt surreal, like playing house, like pretending at a life that couldn't possibly be real. But it was real. The warmth was real, the food was real, the safety was real. And sitting across from this silent man who'd saved them without question, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in years, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could be different, that maybe survival could become something more than just not dying. As full dark settled outside and the fire burned low, Jonas stood and banked the coals for the night. He pointed to the bed. She should sleep there, his gesture said, and then to the cot in the corner where he'd been sleeping since they arrived. "Jonas," Elena said softly, "you don't have to give up your bed. Rose and I can manage on the cot. This is your home." Jonas shook his head firmly and pointed again. Bed for her and Rose, cot for him. The matter was settled. Elena wanted to argue, but she was learning to recognize when Jonas had made up his mind. She settled Rose in the cradle beside the bed and climbed under the covers, still wearing Sarah's dress because she had no nightgown, and it seemed warmer than her thin shift. "Good night, Jonas," she said into the darkness. "And thank you for everything." She heard movement from the cot, then saw the brief glow of a match as Jonas lit a candle. He wrote on his slate and held it up so she could read it in the flickering light. "You are safe here. I promise." Then the candle went out, leaving only the faint red glow of the banked fire. And Elena lay in the darkness, listening to Jonas's steady breathing, Rose's gentle sighs, and the wind howling outside like all the demons she'd left behind, unable to touch her here in this small fortress of quiet kindness. She slept deeply and dreamed of nothing at all. The days began to blur together in the best possible way. Elena woke each morning to find Jonas already tending to the animals, and she'd have coffee and breakfast ready when he returned. They'd eat together in companionable silence. Then Jonas would work on various projects around the cabin, repairing tools, carving, mending harnesses, while Elena cared for Rose and gradually took on more of the household tasks. She swept and cleaned and organized. She mended a tear in one of Jonas's shirts with careful stitches. She baked bread using his sourdough starter, and though her first loaf came out dense and heavy, Jonas ate it without complaint and gave her an encouraging nod. Her second attempt was better. By the third, she was producing loaves that actually looked like bread. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken division of labor that felt natural and easy. Jonas handled the outdoor work and anything requiring physical strength. Elena managed the domestic sphere and Rose's care, and in the evenings they'd sit by the fire, Jonas carving, Elena mending, or just holding Rose, existing in a silence that grew more comfortable with each passing day. But it was the small moments that caught Elena off guard. The way Jonas would glance over when Rose laughed, his expression softening. how he'd wordlessly set a cup of tea beside her when she was feeding the baby, having noticed she liked to drink tea in the afternoons. The morning she woke to find he'd carved a small rattle for Rose, smooth and perfect, with tiny bells inside that chimed softly. "You made this?" Elena asked, turning the rattle over in her hands. It was beautiful work, the wood sanded silk smooth so it wouldn't hurt Rose's gums. Jonas nodded, looking almost embarrassed. "It's perfect," Elena said. "She loves it. Look." Rose was indeed fascinated, waving the rattle and giggling at the sound. Jonas watched her for a long moment, and Elena saw something like pain cross his face. Remembering, she realized, another baby who'd played with toys he'd carved, another child who'd laughed in this cabin. Without thinking, Elena reached out and touched his arm. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for letting us be here, for letting us bring life back into this house." Jonas looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. His gray eyes held something she couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper and more complicated. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again and simply nodded. But that night, Elena noticed the small boots by the door had been moved to the shelf with the carved animals. Not hidden, but repositioned, given a place of honor rather than being left as a daily reminder of absence. It was a small change, but it felt significant, like Jonas was slowly, carefully learning to live with his ghosts rather than in spite of them. 10 days after her arrival, the storm finally broke. Elena woke to genuine sunlight streaming through the window, weak and pale, but sunlight nonetheless. The wind had stopped its constant howling, and when Jonas opened the door to check the weather, the world outside looked almost peaceful, white and clean and crystalline under a pale blue sky. Jonas stood in the doorway for a long moment, surveying the snow-buried landscape. Then he turned back to Elena, and she saw the question in his eyes before he wrote it. "The storm has passed. You can go now, if you want. I will give you supplies, money, for passage." Elena's heart clenched. Of course. The agreement had been shelter until the storm passed. The storm had passed. It was time to leave, to move on, to stop imposing on this kind man who'd already given them so much. She should feel grateful for the opportunity to finally leave, to continue on to wherever she'd been going before she collapsed on his porch. She should feel relieved, but all she felt was terror. "Go where?" The words came out before she could stop them. "I don't have anywhere to go, Jonas. No family, no friends, no place that wants me. I've been running for so long I forgot I need somewhere to run to." Jonas studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he closed the door, shutting out the bright snow and the cleared sky. He crossed to his chair, sat down, and wrote on his slate in slow, deliberate letters, "Then stay." Elena's breath caught. "Stay? Here? But I can't just... You don't want..." Jonas held up a hand, stopping her. He wrote more. "House is big enough. Winter is long. You work hard. Rose is..." He paused, seeming to search for words. Finally, he wrote, "Rose makes house feel alive again." "But what will people say?" Elena asked, even as hope flared bright in her chest. "A woman and baby living with a man who isn't her husband? The town will talk. They'll think..." Jonas shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference. He wrote, "Town talks anyway. I don't care. Do you? Did she?" Elena thought about it honestly. About what people might say, the assumptions they'd make, the judgments they'd pass. Then she thought about the alternative, going back out into that frozen world with Rose, knocking on doors, begging for scraps, sleeping in barns and ditches and under bridges, watching her baby slowly starve because no one would give a desperate woman a chance. "No," Elena said firmly, "I don't care what they think." Jonas nodded, satisfied. He wrote, "Then it is settled. You stay. We help each other. That is all." "That's all?" Elena repeated, searching his face. "You're sure?" "Because, Jonas, I meant what I said. I don't have any way to pay you, not money, not..." Jonas's expression hardened, and he wrote in sharp, emphatic letters. "You already pay. You cook, clean, make bread, make house a home again. That is payment enough." Then softer. "Besides..." Rose needs safe place to grow. You need safe place to heal. I have safe place. Simple. It was simple, or it should have been. But Elena knew the world didn't work that way. Knew that nothing was ever really simple when it came to men and women and expectations and assumptions. Still, looking at Jonas's steady gaze, his patient expression, she found herself believing that maybe, just maybe, this could actually work. Okay, she said softly. Okay, we'll stay. But Jonas, if you change your mind, if it becomes too much or too complicated, you have to tell me. Promise? Jonas nodded and held out his hand. Elena took it, feeling the calluses and scars, the size and strength of it. They shook once, formally, sealing the agreement. They stayed like that for a moment, hands clasped, eyes locked. And Elena felt something shift between them. Not attraction exactly, not yet, but recognition. Two survivors who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and decided to keep surviving together. Two broken people agreeing to share the work of staying alive. Jonas released her hand and stood, pulling on his coat. He pointed outside, then to himself. Work to do, as always. But before he left, he paused at the door and wrote one more message. Welcome home, Elena. Then he was gone, leaving Elena standing in the warm cabin with Rose in her arms and tears streaming down her face. Welcome home. She'd lost her home months ago, years ago really, when Roy changed from the man she'd married into a stranger she feared. She'd been homeless and lost and adrift for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere. But standing in Jonas's cabin, wearing Sarah's dress, holding her baby in front of the fire, Elena felt it again, the sense of being somewhere she was meant to be. Not because of fate or destiny or any grand plan, but because one person had looked at her in her darkest moment and decided she was worth saving. That afternoon, Elena explored beyond the cabin for the first time. The snow was deep but passable, and she needed to see what this place looked like beyond the four walls that had sheltered her. She bundled Rose warmly and ventured out into the crystalline world. The ranch was small but well-maintained, a sturdy barn that housed 2 horses, 3 milk cows, and a handful of chickens. A root cellar built into a hillside, its door secured against predators. A smokehouse. A workshop. Everything positioned with practical efficiency. Everything built to last. Beyond the immediate buildings, the land rolled away in gentle white hills, ringed by distant mountains that looked close enough to touch in the clear air. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. The kind of beauty that didn't care whether you appreciated it or not, that would kill you without malice if you weren't careful. Elena found Jonas in the barn, forking hay for the cows. He looked up when she entered, surprise crossing his face. I wanted to see the place, Elena explained. Thought I should know my way around if I'm staying. Jonas nodded and gestured for her to follow. He showed her where he kept the feed, how to collect eggs from the chickens, which cow was gentle and which one kicked. He moved through the barn with easy confidence, and Elena watched him work, noticing things she hadn't before. How careful he was with the animals. How he spoke to them in low murmurs even though he rarely spoke to people. How his hands, so large and scarred, could be surprisingly gentle when checking a horse's hoof or stroking a cow's flank. You're good with them, Elena observed. Jonas shrugged, but she caught the pleased look that flickered across his face. He wrote on his ever-present slate, Animals don't need words, they need care, consistency, easier than people. Is that why you live out here alone, Dad? Elena asked. Because people are harder? Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on one of the horses' necks. Then he wrote, Came here with Sarah. We wanted quiet, space, life we built ourselves. Then, after a pause, after fever, didn't want to leave. They are buried here. Elena's throat tightened. Can I see? The graves, I mean, if that's not too personal. Jonas studied her, then nodded slowly. He led her out behind the cabin to a small fenced area where 2 wooden crosses stood side by side, carved with careful letters. Sarah Hale, beloved wife. Finn Hale, beloved son. Both bore the same date, March 15th, 1868. They died on the same day, Elena said softly. Jonas nodded, his jaw tight. He wrote, "Finn got sick first, fever. Sarah nursed him. Got sick too. Couldn't save either." He stopped, his hand shaking slightly, then added, "I tried." "I'm sure you did everything you could," Elena said gently. Jonas shook his head sharply and wrote, "Not enough. Should have gone for doctor sooner. Should have." "Jonas," Elena touched his arm, stopping him. "You can't blame yourself for a fever. Those things happen, especially in winter, especially out here. It wasn't your fault." But Jonas just stared at the graves with an expression of such raw, unprocessed grief that Elena had to look away. 3 years, and it was still this fresh, still this sharp. They stood in silence for a while, Rose making small cooing sounds between them, alive and warm while the graves remained cold and silent. Finally, Jonas turned away and headed back toward the cabin, his shoulders tight. Elena followed, carrying Rose, thinking about loss and guilt and the ways people tried to survive them. Jonas had survived by retreating into silence, into the familiar rhythms of work and solitude. She'd survived by running, by focusing everything on keeping Rose alive, by refusing to let herself stop long enough to feel the full weight of everything she'd lost. But maybe, they could both survive in a different way now. Together. Not by forgetting their losses, but by acknowledging them and choosing to keep living anyway. That evening, Elena made stew and fresh bread for dinner. She'd found dried venison in the root cellar and vegetables Jonas had preserved, and she used Sarah's old recipes, found in a small book tucked into a shelf, to prepare a meal that actually tasted good. Hearty, warm, like something a family might eat. Jonas ate with obvious appreciation, finishing his entire bowl and accepting seconds. After dinner, he pulled out his carving again, but this time when Elena asked what he was making, he showed her, a small cradle, sized for a doll. "For Rose?" Elena asked. Jonas nodded. "For when she is bigger, something to play with." Elena felt warmth bloom in her chest. He was thinking ahead, planning for Rose's future, for the child she would become, not just the infant she was now. As if they were really staying, really building something here. As if this was really home. "Thank you," Elena said softly. "For everything. I know I keep saying it, but Jonas, you've given us so much more than shelter. You've given us a chance to actually live instead of just survive." Jonas looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, ducking his head and focusing intently on his carving. But Elena saw the slight softening around his eyes, the way his shoulders relaxed just a fraction. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, Rose sleeping soundly in her cradle, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena felt something that might actually be contentment. Not happiness, that felt too large, too fragile, but contentment. The simple satisfaction of being warm and fed and safe with her daughter. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky. But inside Jonas Hale's cabin, the fire burned steady, and two broken people who'd found each other in a storm, slowly, carefully, began the work of learning to be whole again. 2 weeks after Elena decided to stay, she finally told Jonas the complete truth about Roy Lark. It happened on an afternoon when the winter sun hung low and pale, casting long shadows across the snow. Rose was napping, the cabin was warm, and Elena had been kneading bread dough when her hand suddenly stilled, the rhythm breaking as a memory crashed over her with unexpected force. Jonas looked up from the harness he was mending, his gray eyes questioning. "I need to tell you something," Elena said quietly, her hand still buried in the dough. "About my husband, about why I really left." Jonas set down the harness and picked up his slate, but he didn't write anything, just waited, patient as stone. Elena forced herself to continue needing something to do with her hands. "I told you Roy changed after the war, that he drank, that he got violent, but I didn't tell you everything." She paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't tell you about the night I left." The dough turned smooth and elastic under her fingers. Outside, a crow called, harsh and lonely. "It was 3 days before Christmas," Elena said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "Roy had been drinking since morning. His parents were supposed to visit, but his mother sent a note saying his father was ill. Roy took it as a personal insult, like they were avoiding him on purpose. Maybe they were. I don't know. She shaped the dough into a ball, placed it in the bowl, covered it with a cloth. Then she washed her hands carefully, slowly, before turning to face Jonas. He got worse as the day went on. Kept talking about how nobody respected him anymore, how the war had ruined him, how I'd trapped him with a baby he never wanted. I tried to stay out of his way, but Rose was fussy, teething, I think. She wouldn't stop crying no matter what I did. Jonas's expression hadn't changed, but his hands had gone very still on the leather. Around midnight, Roy came into the bedroom. I was trying to nurse Rose, trying to calm her, but she was screaming, and Roy just stood there in the doorway, swaying, with this look on his face I'd never seen before. Empty, cold, like he wasn't seeing us at all, or like he was seeing something else entirely. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. He said, "I know how to make her quiet." And he walked over and tried to take her from me. I wouldn't let him. I held on tight and asked him what he was doing, where he was taking her, and he said, her voice broke. He said, "Out to the woodshed, just for an hour. The cold will teach her to be silent. It worked on the prisoners. It'll work on her." Jonas stood abruptly, his slate clattering to the floor. "I fought him," Elena continued, the words pouring out now like blood from a wound. I screamed at him, clawed at him, but he was so much stronger. He got Rose away from me and headed for the door. So I grabbed the fire poker and I hit him, right across the shoulders. He dropped Rose, thank God, onto the bed, not the floor, and when he turned around, I hit him again, in the face this time. She looked down at her hands, remembering the jar of impact, the spray of blood. He went down, not unconscious, but stunned enough that I had time to grab Rose and run. I took his father's Christmas money from the kitchen drawer, threw on my coat, and ran out into the snow in my nightgown and house slippers. I didn't even take time to get dressed properly. I just ran. Elena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I heard him behind me, shouting, heard him fall. He was too drunk to run straight. But I didn't stop. I ran all the way to the train station and hid in the ticket office until morning. The station master must have seen something in my face because he didn't ask questions, just sold me a ticket west and told me to get on the first train that came through. She finally looked up at Jonas, meeting his eyes. So you see, I'm not just a woman who left her husband. I'm a woman who stole from him and assaulted him. His family has money and connections. If they find me, they can have me arrested. They can take Rose and give her to Roy's parents, say I'm unfit, that I'm violent and unstable. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe I am those things. Jonas crossed the room in 3 long strides and gripped Elena's shoulders, not hard but firmly, forcing her to look at him. His face was intense, almost fierce, and when he released one shoulder to grab his slate, his hand was shaking. He wrote in large, emphatic letters, "You protected your child. That is not wrong. That is right." "But the law," Elena started. Jonas shook his head violently and wrote, "Law is made by men, men who don't understand. You did what needed to be done." "His family has lawyers," Elena said desperately. "They have money. If they come looking—" Jonas's jaw set in a hard line. He wrote, each letter deliberate and forceful. "They won't find you. And if they do, they go through me first." Elena felt something crack open in her chest. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what kind of people they are. Roy's father owns half the businesses in his county. His uncle is a judge. They can destroy you just for helping me." Jonas held her gaze for a long moment, then wrote slowly, "I have already lost everything that mattered. They can't hurt me, but they can hurt you and Rose, so they don't get the chance." He reached up and touched Elena's face gently, his rough palm against her cheek, thumbing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Then he stepped back, picked up his slate, and wrote, "I understand what it means to fail to protect. I won't let it happen again." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. He was thinking of Sarah and Finn, Elena realized, of the family he couldn't save from fever. And now he was making a promise, to himself as much as to her, that he wouldn't fail again. "Jonas," Elena said softly, What happened to your family wasn't failure. You couldn't have stopped a fever. He shook his head stubbornly, but before he could write a response, Rose woke with a cry. Elena moved to pick her up, grateful for the interruption, for the chance to step back from the intensity of the moment. But as she fed Rose and watched Jonas return to his work with unusual force, attacking the leather harness with sharp, angry movements, Elena felt something shift between them. He knew her worst secret now, knew exactly what she was running from, and he hadn't flinched, hadn't judged, had promised to stand between her and danger. It was terrifying and comforting in equal measure. That night, after dinner, Jonas disappeared into the back room and emerged with a long wooden box. He set it on the table and opened it carefully, revealing a rifle, well-maintained, oiled, clearly expensive. Elena stared at it. "Jonas, what?" He wrote quickly. "Need to know how to use this, just in case." "You want to teach me to shoot?" Elena asked, surprised. Jonas nodded firmly. "Tomorrow, can't always be here. You need to protect yourself and Rose." Elena looked at the rifle, then at Jonas's determined expression, then back at the rifle. The idea of holding a gun, of possibly having to use it, made her stomach turn. But he was right. He couldn't be with them every moment. And if Roy or his family did somehow find them... "Okay," Elena said quietly. "Okay. Teach me." The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Jonas bundled up and gestured for Elena to do the same, then led her out to a flat area behind the barn where he'd set up targets, tin cans balanced on fence posts, pieces of wood propped against hay bales. He loaded the rifle with careful precision, then demonstrated the proper stance, how to sight down the barrel, where to place her hands. His movements were practiced, automatic, speaking of someone who'd spent considerable time with firearms. "Were you in the war?" Elena asked as he handed her the unloaded rifle to practice holding. Jonas shook his head and wrote, "Too young for the big war, but learned to shoot as a boy. Necessary out here." Elena lifted the rifle, surprised by its weight, and tried to mimic the stance he'd shown her. Jonas stepped behind her, adjusting her grip, straightening her shoulders, showing her where to rest the stock against her shoulder to absorb the recoil. His hands were impersonal but gentle, positioning her like a teacher with a student. But Elena was acutely aware of his presence, the solid warmth of him at her back, the careful way he touched her as little as possible while still making sure she held the weapon correctly. "Like this?" she asked, sighting down the barrel at one of the tin cans. Jonas nodded, then loaded a single round and stepped back. He gestured. "When you're ready." Elena took a breath, steadied herself, and squeezed the trigger the way he'd shown her. The rifle kicked harder than she'd expected, the report echoing across the snow. The bullet went wide, missing the can by at least 3 feet. "I'm sorry," Elena said immediately. "I'll do better." Jonas shook his head and wrote, "First shot is never perfect." Again. They practiced for an hour, until Elena's shoulder ached and her ears rang despite the cloth Jonas had her wrap around her head. By the end, she could hit the cans about half the time. Not impressive, but better than nothing. "What if I freeze?" Elena asked as they walked back to the cabin. "What if someone comes and I can't pull the trigger?" Jonas stopped walking and turned to face her. He wrote, "You hit your husband with fire poker to save Rose. You ran into snow in nightgown. You will not freeze. You will do what needs to be done." His confidence in her was almost frightening. Elena wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she'd been terrified every moment, that she'd only hit Roy because panic gave her strength she didn't actually possess. But looking at Jonas's steady gray eyes, at the absolute certainty in his expression, she found herself believing him just a little. Maybe she was stronger than she thought. Maybe survival had forged her into something harder, something capable. They continued to the cabin, and Elena was hanging up her coat when she noticed something strange. Jonas had gone very still, staring at the mantel where the photograph and Sarah's plaque usually sat. Both were still there, but beside them now sat a small piece of cedar, freshly carved with 3 words. "I understand fear." Elena looked at him questioningly. "Did you make this? Last night?" Jonas nodded slowly, not meeting her eyes. He wrote, "Wanted you to know. I don't judge you for being afraid. I am afraid too. What are you afraid of? Elena asked softly. Jonas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he picked up his slate and wrote with obvious difficulty. Afraid of caring again. Afraid of losing again. Afraid that letting you stay will end the same way. Elena's throat tightened. Jonas! He held up a hand, stopping her, and wrote more. But more afraid of not trying. More afraid of staying alone. So we are both afraid. We face it together. Elena crossed to him and, without overthinking it, wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest. She felt him stiffen in surprise, clearly not used to being touched. But after a moment his arms came up slowly and encircled her shoulders, holding her with careful gentleness. They stood like that for a long moment, two frightened people clinging to each other in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, choosing courage over caution, choosing connection over safety. When Elena finally stepped back, Jonas's face was flushed, his expression unreadable. He cleared his throat and moved quickly to the stove, busying himself with unnecessary adjustments to the fire. Elena smiled despite herself. For all his strength and silence, Jonas could be surprisingly awkward when it came to actual emotion. The days continued to pass, winter settling in deep and permanent. The ranch became their entire world, the cabin and barn and endless white landscape beyond. Jonas taught Elena to milk the cows, to collect eggs from temperamental chickens, to read the sky for signs of coming weather. Elena cooked and cleaned and cared for Rose, who grew plumper and happier by the day, her little personality emerging more with each passing week. They developed a language beyond words. A certain look from Jonas meant the animals needed tending. Elena leaving his coffee cup in a particular spot meant she'd noticed something needed repairing. The way Jonas set down his carving knife meant he was ready to listen if she needed to talk. The way Elena hummed certain songs meant she was content, while silence meant she was thinking about things best left in the past. It was a strange kind of intimacy, built not on passion or romance, but on practical cooperation and mutual respect. They were partners in survival, in making it through each day, in maintaining this fragile peace they'd constructed. But Elena couldn't quite shake the fear that it was too fragile, that something would come along and shatter it. Her fear proved prophetic 3 weeks into the new year. It was late afternoon, the sun already sinking toward the mountains, when Elena heard the sound of a horse approaching. She was inside preparing dinner while Jonas was in the barn, and the sound of hoofbeats made her freeze, knife still in her hand, heart suddenly pounding. They never had visitors. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the town was a full day's journey. Who would be coming here? Elena moved to the window and peered out through the frost-etched glass. A single rider approached, bundled against the cold, leading a pack horse. As he drew closer, Elena could make out more details. Well-dressed, expensive coat, good horse, confident bearing. This was no drifter or fellow rancher. This was trouble. She set down the knife and grabbed the rifle Jonas had taught her to shoot, checking automatically to make sure it was loaded. Her hands were shaking but steady enough. She positioned herself by the door, rifle ready but not aimed, and waited. The rider pulled up outside the cabin and dismounted with the easy grace of someone used to horseback. He was middle-aged, clean-shaven, with the kind of face that belonged in courtrooms and banks, rather than on a frontier ranch. He approached the door and knocked. 3 sharp, authoritative raps. "Hello?" he called out. "Is anyone home? I'm looking for someone. I mean no harm." Elena didn't answer, didn't move. Through the window, she saw Jonas emerge from the barn, moving with predatory stillness toward the stranger. The man turned at the sound of footsteps. "Ah, good. You must be the owner. My name is Charles Whitmore. I'm an attorney from Illinois, and I'm looking for a woman. Elena Ward, though she may be using another name. Mid-20s, traveling with an infant girl. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" Elena's blood turned to ice. Roy had sent a lawyer. They'd found her. Jonas stood motionless for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "Are you certain?" Whitmore pressed. "I'm authorized to offer a substantial reward for information leading to her whereabouts. Mrs. Ward's family is quite concerned about her welfare. She left home in a state of mental distress and—" Jonas held up a hand, cutting him off, and gestured to his throat, then shook his head. The message was clear. Can't speak. Whitmore frowned, clearly frustrated. "I see. Well, Can you write? I have some questions that require answers, and the door opened and Elena stepped out, rifle in her hands, not quite pointed at Whitmore, but not quite pointed away either. I can answer your questions, Mr. Whitmore, because I'm Elena Ward, and I'm not going anywhere. Whitmore's eyes widened, then narrowed with professional assessment. Mrs. Ward, thank goodness. Your husband and his family have been frantic with worry. They've had people searching for you for weeks. I'm sure they have, Elena said coldly. Let me save you some time, Mr. Whitmore. I left my husband because he tried to leave my infant daughter in the snow to teach her silence. I took money that was given to him for family expenses, so technically it was mine to take, and I hit him with a fire poker to stop him from hurting my child. Those are the facts. Now you can leave. Whitmore held up his hands in a placating gesture. Mrs. Ward, I understand you've been through a difficult time. Raising a child alone, especially in your condition, must be overwhelming. But running away isn't the solution. Your husband has agreed to seek treatment for his difficulties. His family wants to help you both. His family wants to take my daughter and lock me away, Elena said flatly. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. That's not true at all, Whitmore said smoothly. They simply want to ensure the child is in a stable environment with proper care. Surely you can see that living here, he gestured at the cabin with barely concealed disdain, with a stranger, unmarried, is hardly appropriate for a young mother. Jonas moved then, positioning himself beside Elena, his presence a silent wall of support. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, but the message was clear. She wasn't alone. This man saved my life and my daughter's life, Elena said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. He's shown me more kindness and respect in 3 weeks than my husband showed me in 5 years. So yes, Mr. Whitmore, I can see that this is exactly where I need to be. Whitmore's expression hardened. Mrs. Ward, I'm authorized to inform you that if you don't return voluntarily, your husband's family will pursue legal action. They have evidence of your mental instability, your theft, your assault on your husband. They can have you declared unfit and take custody of the child. This doesn't have to be difficult, but it will be if you insist on, get off my property. Jonas's voice cut through Whitmore's words like a blade through silk. Everyone froze. Elena stared at Jonas in shock. She'd heard him speak a handful of times, his voice always rough and hesitant. But this was different. This was command, authority, barely controlled rage. I beg your pardon? Whitmore said, clearly startled. My property, Jonas repeated, each word deliberate and hard. You're standing on it. You're threatening a woman under my protection. You need to leave. Now. Whitmore's face flushed red. Now see here. I have every right to pee to... You have no rights here, Jonas said, his voice low and dangerous. This is my land. She is my guest. You are trespassing, and if you don't get back on that horse in the next 30 seconds, I'll make you leave. Are you threatening me? Whitmore blustered. I'm an officer of the court. I can have the law. Jonas moved with startling speed, closing the distance between them until he towered over the smaller man. He didn't touch Whitmore, didn't raise his voice, but his physical presence was overwhelming, threatening in a way that needed no words. Leave, Jonas said quietly. Whitmore stumbled backward, his face pale. This isn't over, Mrs. Ward. The Lark family has resources you can't imagine. They'll find legal recourse. They'll find that any action they take will go through me first, Jonas said, and they'll find I don't intimidate easy. Elena Ward and her child are under my protection. That means something out here, even if it doesn't mean anything to lawyers from back east. Now get out. Whitmore retreated to his horse, clearly shaken but trying to maintain dignity. You're making a mistake, both of you. The law is a week's ride from here, Jonas said flatly. And winter isn't done yet. Long time till spring, Mr. Whitmore. Long time for a lot of things to happen to someone foolish enough to come back here making threats. It wasn't quite a threat itself, but the implication was clear enough. Whitmore mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. You'll hear from the Lark family again. Mark my words. Looking forward to it, Jonas said, his voice dripping with dangerous promise. Whitmore spurred his horse and rode away, faster than was safe on the icy trail. Elena and Jonas stood watching until he disappeared over the ridge. the sound of hoofbeats fading into the winter silence. Only then did Elena lower the rifle, her hand suddenly shaking so hard she nearly dropped it. Jonas took it from her gently and set it aside, then cupped her face in his large, warm hands. "You spoke," Elena said, her voice breaking. "I've never heard you speak that much." "Some things need saying," Jonas replied, his voice already returning to its usual disuse roughness. "Some things can't be quiet." "Jonas, did you mean what you said? About them going through you? Because Roy's family really does have money and power. They can make your life hell." Jonas's jaw set in that stubborn line she was learning to recognize. "Let them try. I meant every word. You're staying. Rose is staying. And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Elena threw her arms around him, burying her face in his coat, shaking with relief and residual fear and something else she couldn't quite name. Jonas held her tight, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist. "They know where I am now," Elena whispered against his chest. "They'll come back. Maybe with the sheriff, maybe with a judge's order. They'll find some way to take her from me." "Then we'll be ready," Jonas said quietly. "We'll figure it out. Together." They stood like that until the cold drove them inside, until Rose's fussing reminded them that life continued regardless of threats and fear. That night, Jonas barricaded the door with a heavy beam and loaded both his rifles, setting them where they'd be easy to reach. Elena checked the locks on the windows and tried not to jump at every sound. But as she lay in bed with Rose sleeping peacefully beside her, listening to Jonas's steady breathing from his cot, Elena felt something unexpected beneath the fear. Determination. She'd run once, and it had nearly killed them both. She'd spent months being passive, being victim, letting circumstances push her around like a leaf in a storm. But here, now, with Jonas's quiet strength beside her and her daughter depending on her, Elena felt something hardening in her chest. She wasn't running anymore. This was home. This was safety. This was the life she was choosing, and God help anyone who tried to take it away. Over the next several days, the threat hung over them like storm clouds on the horizon. Jonas became more vigilant, checking the perimeter more frequently, keeping weapons closer at hand. Elena found herself startling at every sound, every unexpected shadow. But life also continued. Cows still needed milking. Chickens still laid eggs. Bread still needed baking. Rose still needed care and attention and love. They couldn't stop living just because danger might be coming. A week after Whitmore's visit, Jonas came in from morning chores with an unusual expression on his face. He'd brought something from town. He'd made a quick supply run the day before, and now he pulled it from his coat pocket, a folded piece of paper, official-looking with a seal at the bottom. Elena's heart sank. "What is it? A summons?" Jonas shook his head and handed it to her. Elena unfolded it with trembling fingers and read. It was a notice posted at the town courthouse and general store, warning about a confidence man operating in the area. The description matched Charles Whitmore exactly. A man claiming to be a lawyer, asking questions about missing women and children, possibly connected to cases of fraud and extortion back east. "He wasn't a real lawyer," Elena breathed. "He was... what? Looking for women to blackmail? Women with secrets to exploit?" Jonas nodded grimly and picked up his slate. "Sheriff says several reports. Man finds desperate women, threatens them, demands money to make problems go away, then disappears." "So Roy's family didn't send him," Elena said slowly, relief and new fear warring in her chest. "But that means they might still be looking. This Whitmore was just a vulture preying on women like me." Jonas wrote, "Sheriff looking for him, but more important, showed me this." He handed Elena another piece of paper, this one older, more worn. It was a wanted notice. For Roy Lark, wanted for assault and attempted murder in Illinois, 2 counts, both against women. A reward offered for information leading to his arrest. Elena stared at the paper, her vision blurring. "Attempted murder. He did it to other women. After I left, he..." Jonas wrote quickly. "You saved yourself and Rose. If you had stayed..." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Elena understood with cold, horrible clarity that if she'd stayed with Roy, she wouldn't have survived the winter. One way or another, she would have ended up like those other women. A casualty of his rage, his madness, his war that never ended. Does this mean... Elena looked up at Jonas with sudden hope. Does this mean they can't take Rose? If he's wanted for crimes, if he's dangerous... Jonas nodded firmly and wrote, "You are safe. Rose is safe. No one can say you were wrong to leave. You saved your life." The relief hit Elena like a physical force. She sat down hard in the nearest chair, the papers fluttering from her nerveless fingers. Safe. They were safe. Not perfectly, not forever, but for now. The threat she'd been running from was real, but it was Roy himself, not his family's power or their lawyers or their judgment. She'd been right to run, right to fight, right to save herself and Rose. Jonas knelt beside her chair and took her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. He didn't say anything, didn't need to, just squeezed gently, letting her know he was there, that he understood, that she wasn't alone in her relief or her lingering fear. "Thank you," Elena whispered, "for going to town, for finding this out, for caring enough to check." Jonas's expression softened. He released her hand and wrote on his slate, "You are family now. Of course I check. Of course I care." Family. The word hit Elena harder than any threat could have. She looked around the cabin, at Rose sleeping peacefully in her cradle, at Jonas's careful handwriting on the slate, at the home they'd been building together through small daily acts of kindness and cooperation, and realized it was true. Somewhere between that first desperate night and now, they'd become something more than strangers sharing space. They'd become a family, broken pieces fitted together into something that actually worked, that actually felt right. "Jonas," Elena said softly, "when spring comes, if you want us to leave, to find our own place, I'll understand. You've done more than enough. You've saved our lives, but I don't want you to feel obligated to..." Jonas held up his hand, stopping her, and wrote in large, emphatic letters, "You stay. This is your home, if you want it to be." "I want it to be," Elena said immediately, "more than anything. But Jonas, what will people say? What will they think about a widow with a child living with a widower? The town already knows we're here. Eventually they'll..." Jonas shrugged, that gesture of profound indifference that Elena had come to recognize. He wrote, "Let them talk. We know the truth. That is enough." And somehow, it was. That evening, as Elena prepared dinner and Jonas carved by the fire and Rose played with the rattle he'd made her, Elena felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace. She wasn't sure she'd ever feel true peace again. But something close. Acceptance, maybe. The understanding that life would never be perfect or safe or simple, but it could be good. It could be enough. She glanced over at Jonas, at his scarred hands moving with precise care over the wood, at his face relaxed and almost content in the firelight. He'd given her everything: shelter, safety, acceptance, respect, and asked for nothing in return except her continued presence, her partnership in maintaining this small fortress against the world. It was more than she'd ever dared hope for, more than she deserved, maybe, though Jonas would argue that point with his slate if she said it out loud. "Jonas?" Elena said softly. He looked up, eyebrows raised in question. "I'm glad the storm brought me here, to you. I know that sounds strange, being grateful for nearly dying, but if I hadn't collapsed on your porch, if you hadn't opened your door..." She trailed off, unable to finish. Jonas set down his carving and wrote slowly, carefully. "I am glad too. House was too empty. Heart was too empty. You and Rose, you brought life back." He hesitated, then added one more line, "You brought me back." Elena felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears, clean tears, the kind that washed away old pain instead of adding to it. She crossed to Jonas and kissed his forehead gently, impulsively, then stepped back before either of them could overthink it. Jonas's face flushed red, but his eyes held warmth, maybe even the beginnings of something deeper. He ducked his head and returned to his carving, but Elena caught the small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Outside, the night deepened and the temperature dropped, winter settling in with renewed vigor. But inside Jonas Hale's cabin, the fire burned bright and steady, and 3 survivors continued the quiet work of learning how to live instead of merely survive. The threat from Illinois seemed distant now, manageable, less terrifying in the light of truth and Jonas's unwavering protection. Elena knew challenges would come. Winter was long, resources would grow scarce, the isolation would test them. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she believed they would face those challenges together and prevail. She'd been running for so long, fleeing from danger toward an uncertain future. But here, finally, she'd found somewhere worth staying, someone worth staying for, a life worth fighting to protect. And if Roy or his family or any other threat came for them, they'd find 2 people who'd already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. They'd find a man who'd rediscovered his voice and his purpose. They'd find a woman who'd learned the difference between surrender and survival. They'd find a family forged in desperation and tempered by determination, and they'd discover that sometimes the quietest people have the strongest will to protect what's theirs. Elena returned to her cooking, humming softly, while Jonas carved and Rose played and the cabin filled with the small, ordinary sounds of home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, they were safe. They were together. They were home. And that was enough. The peace lasted exactly 11 days. Elena was in the kitchen, up to her elbows in flour, as she prepared bread for the week, when she heard it, the sound that had haunted her nightmares for months. A man's voice, rough and slurred, shouting her name. "Elena! Elena Ward! I know you're in there, you thieving bitch!" The bowl slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor, flour exploding across the boards in a white cloud. Elena stood frozen, every muscle locked, every breath trapped in her chest. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But she knew that voice, knew the particular cadence of rage that shaped those words. Roy had found her. She ran to the window and looked out, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. There he was, swaying slightly in the saddle of a tired-looking horse, his face red from cold and drink, his eyes wild. He looked worse than she remembered. Thinner, more haggard, with the hollowed-out look of someone who'd been chasing demons through bottle after bottle. Behind him, standing at a careful distance, was another man, younger, uncertain, holding the reins of a second horse. Not a hired gun or a deputy, just someone Roy had convinced or paid to guide him here. Elena's mind raced. Jonas had gone into town that morning for supplies, a trip he'd been putting off for days. He wouldn't be back until evening at the earliest. She was alone with Rose, and Roy was here, and there was nowhere to run. "Come out here!" Roy bellowed, his words breaking into a cough. "Come out and face what you've done. You took my money. You took my child. You made me look like a fool in front of my family." Rose began to cry, startled by the shouting. Elena's paralysis shattered. She scooped up her daughter and held her close, then moved quickly to the door and threw the heavy beam across it, locking it from the inside. Her hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get it seated properly. "Jonas taught you to shoot," Elena whispered to herself, forcing her breathing to slow. "You know how to use the rifle. You can do this. You have to do this." She settled Rose in her cradle, tucking blankets around her to muffle the sound of her crying, then grabbed the rifle from where Jonas kept it by the door. She checked the load, 5 rounds, more than enough, and moved to the window, keeping back from the glass so Roy couldn't see her clearly. "I'm not coming out, Roy," she called, proud that her voice only shook a little. "You need to leave. Now." Roy laughed, a brittle, broken sound. "Leave? I've been traveling for 3 weeks to find you, through snow and ice and hell itself. You think I'm just going to turn around because you tell me to?" "There's a warrant out for your arrest," Elena said, louder now. "For attempted murder. The sheriff in town knows you're wanted. If you leave now, you might make it out of the territory before they catch you. But if you don't leave, if you try to break in here, I'll shoot you myself." "You?" Roy scoffed. "You wouldn't hurt a fly. You're weak, Elena. You always were. That's why you need me, why you need someone to make you strong." "I was weak," Elena agreed, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I was weak when I stayed with you. When I let you hit me, terrorize me, make me feel like I was nothing. But I'm not weak anymore. I survived 3 weeks on my own with a baby in winter. I found help, I found safety, and I will not let you take that away." Roy dismounted, stumbling slightly as his feet hit the ground. The young man with him called out nervously, "Mr. Lark, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Roy snapped. "Roy, I paid you to get me here, not to give me advice." He turned back to the cabin. "Elena, I'm going to count to 10. If you don't open that door and bring out my daughter, I'm coming in, and when I do, you'll regret ever crossing me." Elena raised the rifle, bracing it against the window frame, sighting down the barrel at Roy's chest. Her hands were steady now, her breathing controlled. Everything Jonas had taught her came back in crystal clarity: stance, sight, trigger squeeze, follow through. "1," Roy shouted. Elena's finger rested lightly on the trigger. 2. She thought of Rose sleeping in her cradle, innocent and trusting and depending on her mother to keep her safe. 3. She thought of Jonas, of his quiet strength, his unwavering protection, his promise that they'd face anything together. 4. She thought of all the doors that had slammed in her face, all the people who'd turned away, all the times she'd been told she was worthless and broken and deserved whatever happened to her. 5. Not anymore. 6. Elena pulled the trigger. The shot cracked across the frozen air, echoing off the hills. The bullet hit the ground 3 feet in front of Roy, kicking up snow and frozen earth. Roy jumped back with a startled yelp, genuine fear crossing his face for the first time. "The next one won't miss," Elena called out, already working the bolt to chamber another round. "I'm not the woman you married, Roy. I'm not the woman you terrorized and broke down. You want to see weak? Look in a mirror. You're a coward who beats women and threatens babies. You're wanted by the law, and you're standing on property owned by a man who promised to protect me. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back on that horse and leave, or I'm going to shoot you, and no jury in the territory will convict me for defending my home and my child from a wanted criminal." Roy's face contorted with rage. "You can't talk to me like that. I'm your husband. I own you." "You never owned me," Elena said coldly. "You just made me believe you did. But I'm done believing your lies." Roy took a step forward, and Elena fired again. This shot was closer, close enough that Roy felt the wind of it passing. He stumbled backward, his face going pale. "She's crazy," he shouted to his companion. "You see this? She's insane. This is why I need to get my daughter away from her." The young man who'd guided him looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Lark, I think maybe we should listen to her. I didn't sign on for any shooting, and if she's telling the truth about you being wanted—" "I'm not wanted," Roy screamed. "Those charges are lies. My family will clear it all up once I get my daughter back and prove Elena's the unstable one." "Your family knows what you are," Elena said. "They've known for years. They just didn't care as long as you kept it behind closed doors. But you couldn't even do that, could you? You had to hurt other women. You had to escalate until even they couldn't protect you anymore." Roy's hand moved to his belt, and Elena saw the glint of metal. He had a gun. Of course he had a gun. She should have known he wouldn't come unarmed. "Don't," Elena warned, raising her rifle higher. "Don't make me do this, Roy. Just leave. Take whatever's left of your life and go somewhere else. Start over. Get help, but leave us alone." "That child is mine," Roy snarled, drawing his pistol. "My blood, my daughter. And I'll be damned if I let some backwoods rancher raise her while you play house with him." He raised the gun, and Elena didn't hesitate. She fired. The bullet caught Roy high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his pistol and fell to his knees in the snow, clutching at the wound with a howl of pain and rage. Elena worked the bolt again, chambering another round, her hands moving on autopilot. She kept the rifle trained on Roy, ready to fire again if he reached for his weapon. But Roy just knelt there, blood seeping between his fingers, staining the pristine snow crimson. His face was twisted with shock and pain, as if he couldn't quite believe she'd actually done it. "You shot me," he gasped. "You actually shot me." "I warned you," Elena said, her voice hollow. "I told you I wasn't the same woman. You wouldn't listen." The young guide had dismounted and was backing away, hands raised. "I want no part of this," he said quickly. "I didn't know about any warrants, didn't know he was planning violence. I just guided him here from town, that's all." "Then guide yourself away," Elena said, without taking her eyes off Roy. "And when you get back to town, tell the sheriff what happened here. Tell him Roy Lark came to my home, threatened me and my child, and drew a weapon first. Tell him I shot in self-defense." The young man nodded rapidly and practically ran to his horse, mounting and riding away at a gallop. Elena barely noticed. All her attention was fixed on Roy, on the man who'd terrorized her for years, now kneeling broken in the snow. "You're gonna hang for this," Roy said through gritted teeth. "Shooting your own husband. They'll—" "I'm not hanging for defending my child from a wanted criminal," Elena interrupted. "And you're not my husband anymore. Whatever we had died the night you tried to freeze Rose to death. You killed it, Roy, not me." She heard hoofbeats then, approaching fast from the direction of town. For a moment, panic flared. Had the guide brought help for Roy? But then she recognized the horse, the rider, the familiar silhouette. Jonas. He must have seen this guide racing away, must have known something was wrong. He rode hard, snow flying from his horse's hooves, and didn't slow until he reached the cabin. He took in the scene with one sweeping glance. Elena at the window with the rifle, Roy bleeding in the snow, the dropped pistol nearby. Jonas dismounted in one smooth motion and moved toward Roy with predatory purpose. Roy tried to stand, tried to run, but Jonas caught him by his injured shoulder and drove him back to his knees with casual brutality. "Elena!" Jonas called, his voice rough but controlled. "You hurt? Rose hurt?" "We're fine," Elena called back. "He drew on me first. I shot him in the shoulder. It's not fatal, but he needs a doctor." Jonas nodded, then looked down at Roy with an expression of such cold contempt that even Elena felt a chill. "You made a mistake coming here," Jonas said quietly. Roy spat blood and glared up at him. "You're the one making a mistake protecting her. That's my wife, my child. You got no right." Jonas's fist connected with Roy's jaw, snapping his head back. Roy crumpled completely, unconscious before he hit the ground. Jonas stood over him for a moment, breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists. Then he looked up at Elena and something in his expression softened. "It's over," he said. "You did good. You protected yourself and Rose. It's over now." Elena lowered the rifle with shaking hands and sagged against the wall, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp and focused drained away all at once, leaving her hollow and trembling. Jonas secured Roy's hands with rope from his saddlebag, binding the unconscious man efficiently. Then he came to the door, and Elena lifted the beam to let him in. The moment he was inside, Elena collapsed against him, the rifle clattering to the floor as her legs gave out. Jonas caught her, holding her up, one hand cradling her head against his chest. "I shot him," Elena whispered. "I actually shot him." "You did what you had to do," Jonas said firmly. "He drew first. He threatened you. No one will blame you for defending yourself and Rose." "But I pulled the trigger. I saw where I was aiming and I pulled the trigger and I wanted to hurt him, Jonas. For just a moment I wanted—" "You wanted to survive," Jonas interrupted gently. "You wanted to protect your child. That's not wrong, Elena. That's human. That's right." Elena clung to him, shaking, while Rose cried in her cradle and Roy groaned as consciousness returned outside. The cabin that had been a sanctuary now felt violated, tainted by violence and fear and the ghost of the life Elena had tried to leave behind. "What happens now?" Elena asked. Jonas helped her to a chair and retrieved the rifle, checking it with practiced efficiency before setting it aside. "Now we wait for the sheriff. That guide will bring him, probably with a deputy or two. They'll take Roy into custody, get him medical care, then transport him back to Illinois to face charges there." "And what about me? What if they—" "They won't," Jonas said with absolute certainty. "You have witnesses. That guide saw Roy draw first. You have the wanted poster showing his crimes. You have me testifying that he came here making threats, that he attacked." "Self-defense, Elena. Clear as day." "But the town. What will they think? What will they say about a woman shooting her husband?" Jonas knelt in front of her chair and took both her hands in his. "The town will see a mother who protected her child from a dangerous man. They'll see someone brave enough to stand her ground when threatened, and anyone who sees anything else can answer to me." Elena searched his face, looking for doubt or judgment, but found only steady support and something deeper, pride maybe, or respect, or the beginnings of something neither of them was quite ready to name. "You came back early," Elena said. "How did you know?" "Didn't know," Jonas admitted. "But I got to town and heard talk. Someone matching Roy's description, asking questions at the saloon, paying for information about ranches outside town, about women living with men they weren't married to. The bartender mentioned it to me when I was getting supplies. I left everything and rode back as fast as I could." "You left the supplies?" "Supplies can be replaced," Jonas said simply. "You can't." The simplicity of it, the pure truth of it, made Elena's eyes burn with unshed tears. This man who'd started as a stranger had become her protector, her partner, her family. He'd ridden through dangerous territory at a gallop because he'd heard a rumor that she might be in danger. He'd abandoned supplies they needed because she mattered more. "Thank you," Elena whispered, "for everything, for believing me, for protecting us, for—" Jonas shook his head and pressed a finger gently to her lips. "No thanks needed. We're family. We protect each other." He stood and moved to Rose's cradle, lifting the crying baby with surprising tenderness. Rose quieted almost immediately, recognizing Jonas's touch, his smell, the safety of his arms. He walked her around the cabin, bouncing gently, murmuring soft nonsense words Elena could barely hear. Outside, Roy had regained consciousness and was shouting again, threats and accusations and demands that quickly devolved into whimpering pleas for help. Jonas ignored him completely, focused entirely on soothing Rose. "Should we bring him inside?" Elena asked. "His shoulder? The cold?" "He can wait," Jonas said flatly. "He's not bleeding out. He's not freezing. He wanted to hurt you and Rose. He drew a weapon in front of your home. He gets to be uncomfortable until the law arrives to deal with him properly." Elena should have felt guilty. Should have felt something like mercy or compassion for the man she'd once loved enough to marry. But all she felt was a grim satisfaction that Roy was finally facing consequences for his actions, finally experiencing a fraction of the fear and pain he'd inflicted on others. The sheriff arrived 2 hours later, bringing 2 deputies and a doctor from town. Elena told her story from the beginning: the escape from Illinois, the wanted poster, the lawyer who'd come asking questions, today's confrontation. She spoke clearly and calmly, showing them where Roy had drawn his weapon, where she'd fired, how Jonas had arrived to find Roy already down. The young guide corroborated everything, explaining how Roy had hired him, how he'd seemed increasingly unstable during the journey, how he'd clearly drawn first. The doctor examined Roy's shoulder, a through-and-through wound, painful but not life-threatening, and patched him up with professional efficiency. Throughout it all, Jonas stood beside Elena like a silent sentinel, his presence a constant reminder that she wasn't alone, that she had support, that she had someone willing to speak for her if her own voice failed. The sheriff, a weathered man named Crawford, who'd been enforcing law in the territory for 20 years, listened to everything with shrewd attention. When Elena finished, he nodded slowly. "Self-defense," he said firmly. "Clear as I've ever seen it. Man wanted for crimes in another state comes to a woman's home, threatens her, draws a weapon. She fires to protect herself and her child. No question about it." "But he's my husband," Elena said, needing to be absolutely certain. "Doesn't that change things? Don't I have some kind of duty to—" "Ma'am," Crawford interrupted gently, "maybe back east they have different ideas about what a wife owes a husband. But out here, we've got a simpler view. Nobody has the right to threaten another person's life, regardless of what legal papers say they're connected by. You did what needed doing. That's the end of it as far as I'm concerned." Roy, bandaged and bound in the back of a wagon, started shouting again. "She's lying! She attacked me! She stole my child and my money and—" "Mr. Lark," Crawford said wearily, "you're wanted for attempted murder in Illinois. You came here armed and making threats. You drew a weapon on a woman in her own home. I strongly suggest you stop talking before you make things worse for yourself." "This isn't over," Roy snarled at Elena. "My family will—" "Your family already disowned you," Crawford said flatly. "Got a telegraph from them 3 days ago, responding to our inquiry. They want nothing to do with you or your legal troubles. Said you're on your own." So I'd save my energy for worrying about your own neck rather than making threats you can't back up. The news hit Roy like a physical blow. Elena watched his face crumple, watched the realization sink in that he'd lost everything: his family's support, his freedom, his power to terrorize. He looked suddenly small and pathetic, a shadow of the monster that had haunted her nightmares. "We'll transport him to the territorial prison to await extradition," Crawford told Elena. "Illinois has already requested it. He'll stand trial there for the other attacks. You'll need to testify, probably, but that won't be for months yet. Until then, you're free and clear." "And Rose?" Elena asked. "His family can't claim her?" "They've made no such claim," Crawford assured her. "And given Mr. Lark's crimes and his family's abandonment of him, I'd say you've got sole custody in the eyes of any reasonable court. Your daughter is yours, Mrs. Ward. Nobody's taking her from you." Elena felt the last knot of tension in her chest finally release. Rose was safe. They were both safe. The nightmare was truly over. The sheriff's party prepared to leave, loading Roy into the wagon with his injuries. Crawford approached Elena one more time, hat in his hands. "Ma'am, I have to ask, what are your intentions here? Living situation, I mean. Town's already talking, and while I don't give much weight to gossip, there's going to be questions about you staying here with Mr. Hale." Jonas stiffened beside her, but Elena spoke before he could. "My intentions are to continue living here, helping Mr. Hale with his ranch, and raising my daughter in safety. If the town has questions, they can bring them to me directly. I'm not ashamed of anything I've done, and I'm not going to change my life because people like to talk." Crawford's weathered face creased into an approving smile. "Fair enough. For what it's worth, most folks in town think highly of Jonas here. Decent man, keeps to himself, doesn't cause trouble. If he vouches for you, that'll carry weight with the people who matter." He tipped his hat to Jonas, who nodded back, then climbed onto his horse. The wagon carrying Roy rattled away down the trail, and Elena watched it go with a strange sense of disconnection. That man in the wagon was her husband, legally speaking, the father of her child, the person she'd once thought she'd spend her whole life with. But he was also a stranger, a danger, a threat she'd finally overcome. "You all right?" Jonas asked quietly as the wagon disappeared over the ridge. Elena considered the question honestly. "I don't know. I shot someone today. I might have killed him if my aim had been different. That should bother me more than it does." "You protected Rose," Jonas said. "You protected yourself. That's what matters." "Is it always this simple for you?" Elena asked, not unkindly. "Right and wrong, black and white?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, staring at the horizon where the wagon had vanished. "No," he admitted finally. "Not always, but when someone threatens a child, when someone draws a weapon on a woman in her own home, that's simple enough." They stood together in the cold afternoon, watching the sun sink lower toward the mountains. Rose had fallen asleep in Jonas's arms, exhausted by all the commotion. The cabin behind them stood solid and safe, waiting for them to return to the rhythms of daily life. "The flour," Elena said suddenly, remembering. "I dropped the bowl when Roy started shouting. There's flour everywhere." "We'll clean it up," Jonas said simply. "We'll clean it up and bake more bread and continue on. That's what we do." Such a simple statement, but it held everything Elena needed to hear. They would clean up the mess. They would continue on. Life would resume its patterns, its routines, its small daily acts of survival and care. They went inside, and Jonas was right. Flour covered half the kitchen floor, white and fine as fresh snow. But it was just flour, just a mess, something that could be swept up and washed away, unlike the damage Roy had tried to inflict, unlike the trauma he'd attempted to perpetuate. Elena set to cleaning while Jonah settled Rose in her cradle and checked the doors and windows, reinforcing the security that had been violated. They worked in their familiar silence, restoring order, reclaiming their space. That evening, Elena made a simple dinner of salt pork and beans, using the last of the old bread since the new batch had been interrupted. They ate quietly, neither quite ready to process everything that had happened. The violence, the confrontation, the blood on the snow. It all felt surreal, like something that had happened to different people in a different place. After dinner, Jonas pulled out his carving, but instead of working on the project he'd been focused on, a small rocking horse for Rose, he picked up a fresh piece of cedar and began something new. Elena watched his hands move, saw the careful consideration in each cut, the way he held the wood as if listening to what it wanted to become. "What are you making?" she finally asked. Jonas didn't look up, but he tilted the piece so she could see. It was taking shape as a small plaque, similar to the one Sarah had made years ago. Elena could already make out the first few letters. Courage. "Is that for me?" Elena asked softly. Jonas nodded, still carving, adding the next letters with meticulous care. Elena felt her throat tighten. She'd shot a man today, had drawn blood, caused pain, defended her home with violence. She should feel guilty or horrified or traumatized. Instead, she felt strangely calm, as if she'd passed some crucial test and proven to herself that she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. "I'm not sure I deserve it," Elena said. "The courage, I mean. I was terrified the entire time." Jonas stopped carving and picked up his slate. Courage isn't not being afraid. Courage is being afraid and doing it anyway. "Is that what you did?" Elena asked. "When you opened the door to me. Were you afraid?" Jonas nodded slowly. Afraid of caring, afraid of losing, afraid of feeling again. He paused, then added, "Did it anyway." They looked at each other across the cabin, understanding passing between them without need for more words. They were both brave and broken, both terrified and determined, both doing the hard work of choosing life over fear every single day. "Thank you for not giving up on us," Elena said, "even when it would have been easier." Jonas set down his carving and crossed to her, pulling her gently to her feet. He wrapped his arms around her and Elena pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the solid warmth of him, the safety he represented. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other while Rose slept and the fire crackled and the night deepened outside. Two people who'd survived the worst and chosen to keep surviving together. When they finally separated, Jonas cupped Elena's face in his large, scarred hands and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough but certain. "Both of you, I promise." "I know," Elena whispered. "I believe you." And she did. For the first time in years, maybe in her entire life, Elena truly believed she was safe. Not because the world had suddenly become less dangerous or because all threats had vanished, but because she discovered her own strength, her own courage, her own ability to stand and fight when everything she loved was at stake. And because she had Jonas beside her, this quiet, scarred man who'd chosen to open his door when everyone else had slammed theirs shut, who'd given her shelter and safety and something she'd never expected to find again. Hope. That night, Elena lay in bed with Rose sleeping beside her, listening to Jonas's steady breathing from his cot. The cabin was silent except for the usual nighttime sounds, the settling of logs, the whisper of wind, the occasional pop from the banked fire. But for the first time since that desperate night in Illinois, Elena didn't jump at every sound, didn't lie awake imagining footsteps approaching, doors breaking, dangers coming. Instead, she simply closed her eyes and let herself rest, truly rest, knowing that the worst was finally behind her. Roy was gone. The threat was ended. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer terrifying. And in this small cabin on the Colorado frontier with snow piled deep outside and a fire burning low inside, 3 survivors who'd found each other in the storm continued the quiet work of building something new from the wreckage of what had been lost. Something worth protecting. Something worth fighting for. Something that felt almost like family, and more like home. The snow began to melt 3 weeks after Roy was taken away. It happened slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. The icicles hanging from the eaves dripping in the afternoon sun, the drifts against the barn settling and compacting, patches of dark earth appearing like promises beneath the white. Then all at once, it seemed, winter loosened its grip and the world transformed from frozen stillness into rushing, dripping, muddy life. Elena stood at the window one morning in early March, watching water run in rivulets down the trail, and felt something shift inside her chest. The thaw wasn't just happening outside. It was happening within her too, some long-frozen part of her soul finally beginning to soften and wake. "Spring's coming," Jonas said from behind her, his voice still rough but used more often now, as if he was slowly remembering how to speak after years of silence. I can't quite believe it, Elena admitted. There were days in January when I thought winter would never end, that we'd be frozen here forever. Jonas moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Would that be so terrible? Being here forever? Elena looked up at him, at the face she'd come to know so well. The scars, the weathered skin, the gray eyes that could be so cold to outsiders but held such warmth when they looked at her and Rose. No, she said softly, that wouldn't be terrible at all. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what they'd both been carefully not saying for months. This arrangement that had started as temporary shelter had become something else entirely. Something neither of them quite knew how to name, but both felt with increasing certainty. Jonas cleared his throat and looked away, color rising in his cheeks. Need to check the fence lines today. Melting snow sometimes brings down posts. Could use help if you're willing. Of course, Elena said, grateful for the return to practical matters. Let me get Rose ready. She could use some fresh air anyway. They spent the morning walking the property line together, Rose bundled against Elena's chest in a sling Jonas had fashioned from canvas and leather. The baby was growing quickly now, her face filling out, her eyes bright and curious as she took in the changing world. She babbled constantly, reaching for everything, and Jonas had taken to carving her small toys, animals and rattles and simple puzzles that kept her entertained for hours. As they worked, checking posts and clearing debris, Elena found herself noticing things she'd been too afraid or exhausted to see before. The way Jonas's hands moved with such confidence and care, how he'd glance over at Rose every few minutes, as if needing to reassure himself she was safe and content. The small smile that tugged at his mouth when Elena made a joke or sang while she worked. He was beautiful, she realized with sudden clarity. Not in any conventional sense. His face was too scarred, too weathered, too marked by grief and hardship. But in the way he moved through the world with quiet competence, in his gentleness with creatures smaller and weaker than himself, in his unwavering loyalty and protection. Jonas, Elena said, then paused, unsure how to continue. He looked up from the post he was examining, eyebrows raised in question. I've been thinking, Elena started, then stopped again. How did you tell someone they'd saved your life without making it sound like gratitude rather than something deeper? About us, about this arrangement. Jonas went very still, his expression carefully neutral. He waited, patient as always, giving her space to find her words. When spring really arrives, Elena continued, when the pass is clear and travel is possible again, people from town will start coming out more. There will be talk. About me living here with you, unmarried, with Rose. Sheriff Crawford warned me about it. Don't care about talk, Jonas said flatly. Let them say what they want. But I care about you, Elena said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. I care about your reputation, your standing in the community. I don't want to damage that by being here. Jonas set down his tools and crossed to her in 3 long strides. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Elena, listen to me. I don't give a damn what people say, but if you're worried, if you want things different... He paused, swallowed hard. We could make it proper, legal, get married. Elena's breath caught. Jonas, you don't have to... Not about have to, Jonas interrupted. About want to. About choosing to. His voice softened. I'm not good with words. Never have been. But these months with you and Rose, they've been the first time since Sarah and Finn died that I've felt alive instead of just existing. You make this house a home again. You make me want to be more than just a man waiting to die. You're not proposing out of obligation? Elena asked, needing to be certain. Not because you think I need protecting or because of what people might say? I'm proposing, Jonas said carefully, because I love you, both of you. Because I want you here not just for this winter, but for every winter. Because when I think about my future, I can't imagine it without you in it. Elena felt tears spill over, but they were good tears, clean tears. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't think I could love anyone again after Roy, after everything, but you. You're so different from him. You're kind and gentle and strong in all the ways that matter. You've given me everything and asked for nothing. How could I not love you? Jonas kissed her then, tentatively at first, as if afraid she might pull away. But Elena leaned into him, kissing him back with all the pent-up emotion and gratitude and hope she'd been carrying. Rose made a sound of protest between them, squished by their embrace, and they broke apart with shared laughter. Is that a yes? Jonas asked, a smile transforming his usually serious face. You'll marry me? Yes, Elena said firmly. Yes, absolutely yes. Jonas pulled her close again, more carefully this time, his arms around both her and Rose, his face buried in her hair. Elena felt him shaking slightly and realized with wonder that he was crying, silent tears of relief and joy and release. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the muddy spring sunshine, while around them the world continued its thaw and transformation. A family by choice rather than blood, by survival rather than tradition, by love that had grown slowly and steadily like spring after a killing frost. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a clear April morning when the last of the snow had finally melted and the valley was beginning to green. They held it at the cabin rather than in town, with only a handful of witnesses, Sheriff Crawford, the doctor who'd treated Roy's wound, a neighboring rancher and his wife who'd befriended them, and the minister who traveled the circuit through the mountain settlements. Elena wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Jonas had bought in town, simple but beautiful in pale blue cotton, with white lace at the collar. Jonas wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair freshly cut, his beard neatly trimmed. He looked uncomfortable in formal clothes, but happy, genuinely happy, in a way Elena suspected he hadn't been in years. Rose, nearly 8 months old now, wore a tiny dress Elena had sewn from scraps, and she babbled cheerfully throughout the ceremony, making everyone smile. When the minister asked if Jonas took Elena to be his wife, he answered in a clear, strong voice that carried across the yard, "I do." And when he asked the same of Elena, she looked at Jonas, at this man who'd opened his door in a blizzard, who'd protected her without question, who'd chosen to love again despite knowing the cost, and said with absolute certainty, "I do." The kiss was chaste and brief, mindful of their audience, but Jonas's eyes held a promise of more to come. Elena felt her cheeks flush as she smiled up at him, feeling suddenly shy despite everything they'd been through together. The neighbors had brought food, a luxury after months of plain ranch fare, and they shared a meal in the cabin that felt almost festive. People laughed and talked, and several made a point of telling Elena how glad they were that Jonas had found happiness again, how good it was to see him smile. He was like a ghost for 3 years, Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch confided to Elena while they were washing dishes. Just going through the motions, working himself half to death because he couldn't stand to sit still. We worried about him, wondered if he'd ever come back to himself. But look at him now. Elena followed her gaze to where Jonas sat with Rose on his knee, the baby clutching his finger and trying to stand on his thigh. His face was soft with affection, utterly transformed from the blank, closed-off expression Elena had first encountered. "You've been good for him," Mrs. Patterson continued. "And that baby, well, she's brought life back to this place. You can feel it." "He's been good for us too," Elena said quietly. "He saved our lives. I'll never forget that." "Seems to me you saved each other," Mrs. Patterson said wisely. "That's how the best marriages work." The guests left before evening, mindful of the journey home, and suddenly Elena and Jonas were alone, truly alone, for the first time as husband and wife. Rose had fallen asleep during the festivities, exhausted by all the attention, and Jonas carried her carefully to the small bed he'd built for her in the corner. "She's getting too big for the cradle," he said softly, tucking blankets around her, "growing so fast." Elena came to stand beside him, watching their daughter, because that's what Rose was now, legally and in every way that mattered, sleep peacefully. "Thank you for loving her," Elena whispered, "for treating her as your own." "She is my own," Jonas said simply. "From the moment you collapsed on my porch with her in your arms, she was mine to protect. The papers just made it official." They stood together for a moment longer, then Jonas took Elena's hand and led her to the bed they would now share, the bed he'd given her that first night and slept apart from for months. The bed that had once belonged to him and Sarah, but would now be theirs together. Elena felt nervousness flutter in her stomach. Jonas, I should tell you, with Roy, it was never, he wasn't. We don't have to do anything tonight, Jonas said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. Or any night until you're ready. I'm not him, Elena. I'll never be him. Whatever we do, whenever we do it, it'll be because we both want to. No pressure, no demands. Just us, figuring it out together. Elena felt something release in her chest. She'd been so afraid he'd expect things, demand things, that marriage would transform him into someone different, someone frightening. But he was still Jonas, still gentle and patient and considerate. I want to try, Elena said, sitting beside him. I want to be a real wife to you. I need you to be patient with me, to go slow. Always, Jonas promised. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather light. We have all the time in the world. No rush. They lay down together, fully clothed at first, just holding each other in the darkness. Jonas's arms were warm and strong around her, and Elena pressed close to him, feeling safe in a way she'd never felt with Roy, even in the early days when he'd been gentle. Tell me about Sarah, Elena said softly. If you can. I want to know about her, about the life you had before. Jonas was quiet for so long Elena thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and halting, telling her about a young woman he'd met at a church social who'd laughed at his awkwardness and agreed to go walking with him anyway. About their courtship, their marriage, their journey west to build something of their own. About Finn's birth, the joy of holding his son for the first time, watching him grow into a curious, energetic boy. He would have been 9 now, Jonas said. Would have been old enough to really help around the ranch, to learn the work. I think about that sometimes. All the things he'll never do, never become. Do you think Sarah would be angry? Elena asked. That you moved on? That you're with me now? Jonas considered this. No. Sarah was practical. She'd want me to be happy, to have help, to not be alone. She'd like you, I think. She'd see how strong you are, how brave. She'd approve. I hope so, Elena said. I hope they both would. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and memories, learning each other in this new way. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, it was gentle and slow and nothing like what Elena had experienced with Roy. Jonas was patient and careful, checking constantly to make sure she was comfortable, that she wanted to continue. There was no violence, no pain, no sense of being used or taken. Just two people choosing each other, building intimacy brick by careful brick. Afterward, Elena lay with her head on Jonas's chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling more at peace than she could remember ever feeling. Thank you, she whispered. For what? Jonas asked, his hand stroking her hair. For being you, for being exactly who you are. Jonas pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. Thank you for knocking on my door, for giving me a reason to open it. Spring gave way to summer, and the ranch came fully alive. Jonas planted a kitchen garden, and Elena tended it daily, watching with wonder as green shoots became full plants heavy with vegetables. They worked side by side in the lengthening days, repairing winter damage, preparing for next year's cold, building and improving and expanding. Rose took her first steps in June, wobbling across the cabin floor from Elena to Jonas, while both parents cheered her on. She said her first word, Dada, while looking directly at Jonas, and his face transformed with such joy that Elena had to look away, blinking back tears. In July, a letter arrived via the circuit rider who delivered mail to the remote ranches. It was from Illinois, from the courthouse, informing Elena that Roy Lark had been convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The trial had proceeded without her testimony, based on the evidence of other victims who'd come forward. She was legally free of him, and his parental rights had been terminated. Elena read the letter twice, then handed it to Jonas. He read it carefully, then set it aside and pulled her into his arms. It's really over, Elena said, almost unable to believe it. Can't hurt us anymore. He can't come back. Never, Jonas said firmly. You're safe. Rose is safe. We're a family, and nobody can change that. They celebrated quietly that night, with a special dinner and a rare bottle of wine Jonas had been saving. And later, in their bed, they made love with a freedom neither had felt before. The freedom that came from knowing the past was truly behind them, that the future was theirs to build however they wanted. In August, neighbors began stopping by more frequently, bringing gifts for the baby, sharing news, treating Elena and Jonas as a proper couple rather than a scandalous arrangement. Elena made friends with Mrs. Patterson and several other ranch wives, women who taught her the specific skills needed for frontier life and welcomed her into their small community. The town, too, began to accept them. Elena went in with Jonas for supplies and church services, Rose on her hip, and people greeted her warmly. A few old biddies still whispered, but their disapproval meant nothing compared to the solid support of the decent folks who saw Elena and Jonas for what they were, survivors who'd found each other and built something good from tragedy. One September afternoon, Elena was in the garden harvesting the last of the tomatoes when she heard Jonas call her name. She looked up to find him standing at the barn with something in his hands, a wooden sign freshly carved and painted. "What is it?" she asked, wiping dirt from her hands as she approached. Jonas held it up so she could see. The sign read, "The Hale Family." And below, in smaller letters, Jonas, Elena, and Rose. "Thought we needed a proper sign for the gate," Jonas said, looking almost shy. "To show everyone who lives here. To make it official." Elena traced the letters with her finger, emotion welling up in her throat. A family. They were a family, claimed and declared, their names together for everyone to see. "It's perfect," she managed. "Help me hang it?" Together they carried the sign to the gate at the end of the drive and mounted it securely. Elena stepped back to admire their work, Rose balanced on her hip, Jonas's arm around her waist. "This is home," Elena said softly. "Really, truly home." "Always was," Jonas replied, "from the moment you got here. Just took us a while to realize it." That evening, after Rose was asleep and the dishes were done, Elena found Jonas at his workbench in the corner of the cabin. He was carving something new, and when she asked to see it, he showed her, a small wooden plaque similar to the ones on the mantel. This one read, "Family is something no one can take from you." "For Rose," Jonas explained, "for when she's older. So she knows that family isn't just about blood. It's about who chooses to love you, who chooses to stay." Elena pressed close to him, overwhelmed by the simple truth of it. She'd lost the family she was born into, fled from the family she'd married into, and nearly died trying to protect the family she'd created with Rose. But here, in this cabin, with this quiet, scarred man who'd answered her desperation with shelter and slowly, carefully given her his heart, she'd found the truest family of all. Winter came again as it always did in the mountains, but this year Elena wasn't afraid. The cabin was well stocked with food and fuel. The animals were healthy and secure, and most importantly, she wasn't alone. She had Jonas beside her, strong and steady and utterly dependable. She had Rose, growing and thriving and learning new things every day. She had friends in town, neighbors who would help if needed, a community that had accepted her. On Christmas morning, Elena woke to find Jonas already up, stoking the fire. Rose was just beginning to stir in her bed, making the small morning sounds that meant she'd wake fully any moment. "Merry Christmas," Jonas said, turning from the fire with a smile. "Merry Christmas," Elena replied, going to him for a morning kiss that had become their ritual. "Got something for you?" Jonas said, pulling a small package from his pocket. "Nothing fancy, but—" Elena unwrapped it carefully to find a locket on a delicate chain. Inside were two tiny portraits, one of Rose, the other of Jonas, painted with remarkable skill. "When did you have time to do this?" Elena asked, amazed. "Been working on it for months," Jonas admitted. "Wanted you to have something to carry them with you. Us. Your family." Elena fastened the locket around her neck, feeling its comforting weight against her heart. "I love it. I love you." She pulled out her own gift, suddenly nervous. "I made you something too." It was a shirt, sewn from fabric she'd carefully selected in town and worked on in secret during Rose's naps. The stitching was her best work, every seam perfect, every button secure. But more than that, she'd embroidered his initials on the inside collar, and below them, 3 small figures holding hands, a man, a woman, and a child. Jonas held the shirt reverently, his eyes taking in every detail. When he noticed the embroidery, his face crumpled with emotion. "Elena," he said, his voice breaking. "It's you. We're your family," Elena said simply. "I wanted you to carry us with you too, close to your heart." Jonas pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. Rose chose that moment to wake fully, calling out, "Mama! Dada!" And they broke apart with laughter to go to her together. The day passed in simple joy. Gifts opened, a special dinner prepared, carols sung while Jonas played a battered harmonica Elena had never known he owned. Rose was delighted by everything, especially the new wooden horse Jonas had carved for her, painted with bright colors and mounted on rockers so she could ride it back and forth across the floor. That night, after Rose was asleep and the fire had burned low, Elena and Jonas sat together on their bed, reviewing the year that had passed. "A year ago, I was dying in the snow," Elena said quietly. "I was ready to give up, to let go, to surrender Rose to a stranger just to save her life. I couldn't imagine surviving another day." "And now?" Jonas prompted. Elena looked around the cabin, at the cheerful chaos of toys and laundry and everyday living, at the photographs on the mantel that now included one of their wedding day, at Rose sleeping peacefully in her little bed. "Now I can't imagine my life any other way. This is where I'm meant to be, with you, with her." "Home." Jonas pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the last embers of the fire glow and fade. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and steady, blanketing the world in white. But inside, the cabin was warm and safe, and full of love. "Thank you for opening your door," Elena whispered. "Thank you for taking us both in when you could have just turned away." Jonas was quiet for a moment, then spoke in that careful way he had when expressing something important. "I told you before. House was too empty. But it was more than that. When I saw you on that porch, saw you offering up your child to save her life, I saw real love. Sacrificial love. The kind Sarah had for Finn. Tried to save him even when it cost her own life. I couldn't turn away from that. Wouldn't have mattered if you'd been the worst person in the world. That kind of love deserves protection." "And now?" Elena asked. "Do you still see it that way? Do you ever regret—" "I see a woman who's become my partner, my wife, my best friend," Jonas interrupted. "I see the mother of my daughter because Rose is mine now, as much as if I'd fathered her myself. I see someone brave and strong and kind who makes me want to be better, do better, live better. Regret? Never. Not for 1 second." Elena kissed him then, pouring everything she felt into it: gratitude, love, hope, promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, eyes bright. "We should probably sleep," Elena said reluctantly. "Rose will be up early." "Probably," Jonas agreed, but neither of them moved. They just sat there, holding each other, reluctant to let go of the perfect peace of the moment. Finally they lay down together, wrapped in each other's arms, and Elena felt herself drifting toward sleep with a contentment so deep it felt almost like grace. The storm that had brought her here was long past, but its memory remained, not as trauma or pain, but as the beginning of everything good that had come after. The cold that nearly killed them had instead forged them into something stronger, something unbreakable. Elena's last thought before sleep claimed her was simple and profound. She was home, not just in this place, but in this life, with this man, with this family they'd built from broken pieces and fierce hope. The wind howled outside, the same wind that had nearly ended her story before it could truly begin. But now it was just wind, just weather, just another part of the wild, beautiful, unforgiving world they'd chosen to make their home. And inside Jonas Hale's cabin, inside Elena Hale's home, the fire flickered low but steady, keeping watch through the long winter night. A mother, a father, a child. A family bound not by blood or circumstance, but by choice and courage, and the simple revolutionary act of opening a door when someone knocked. The rancher who'd said nothing had said everything that mattered. He'd answered desperation with shelter, fear with safety, and loneliness with love that grew slow and steadfast, like spring after a killing frost. And that, in the end, was the truest magic of all, That two broken people and one innocent child could find each other in the worst possible moment and build from their shared wreckage something beautiful and lasting and true. Something no storm could destroy. Something called home.